The night opened like a quiet fan, each rib a silvered breath slipping through pine needles that whispered of old counsel and patient oaths. Beneath those boughs, a man knelt, still as a river stone placed by a careful hand, his armor dark with oil and years, remembering rain the way a roof remembers footsteps. His palm rested on the scabbard across his knees, and within it the blade waited, a narrow winter sleeping, listening with him to the wind. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a temple bell released a soft note. It floated over low fields like a lantern set upon still water, a small sun that had decided to dream rather than blaze. He could not see the village, yet he felt its woven hush, the thatch roofs breathing, the dogs turning in their sleep when a fox's shadow touched the gate, the embers in hearths coaxed back to a quiet glow by a patient hand. He had come because promise has a scent, resin and cool earth, and a vow should be spoken where sky may witness and ground may keep its secret. Above him, a lacquered prayer tag swung from a twig, its ink thinned by rain into tenderness. He bowed to it as one bows to a traveler met and missed. When he began, his words did not cut the night. They slipped into it, measured and low, as if the moon itself leaned to listen. He pledged not conquest. Conquest is a noisy drum that forgets its own echo, but attentiveness to the weight of each step, to the polish of steel as a mirror of the mind, to the narrow country between anger and justice where courage is born quietly. Perhaps vows are a music only midnight understands. Perhaps the pines have learned to keep time with it. When he finished, a cone dropped and landed with a modest thud, like a scent from an elder who smiles without showing teeth. He rose. The laced plaits of his cuirass murmured, old friends meeting after long roads. Letters tucked in his sleeve brushed his skin, one bearing his lord's red seal, a son pressed firm, another penned by a mother asking the season to pass without hoofbeats, a third from a scholar requesting a blade be drawn not against a body, but a rumor that had begun to eat a village's breath. He carried more than paper. He carried a boy's laughter he had once failed to protect, the way an unsheathed blade can divide a conversation, the memory of a teacher's cane touching his shoulder on the day he learned that not all victories wear banners. What is a warrior, he wondered, but a student of endings who tries, when permitted, to begin again? He stepped from the pine's shadow. The path received him with the soft crunch of small stones tasting new weight. The air smelled of rice husk and river mud, and far away a night heron skimmed the surface of a dream and did not return. He had been asked to settle a quarrel between neighbors, small, they said, though small knives cut precisely and deep. A boundary stone had fallen in the rain, and the line between fields, between yours and mine, bread and hunger, had blurred. Such disputes are rarely about stone. They sprout from older roots, watered by seasons of silence. With each step the village formed from suggestion into pattern, shutters at half-breath, roofs like folded wings, the polite cough of a cricket behind a rain barrel. He paused at a roadside shrine. Its fox wore a washed red bib, carefully tied. He bowed to the little gate as one bows to a teacher who asks difficult questions without raising their voice. At the first house, a sandal swayed on a peg, measuring the night. He knocked once, then again, letting silence breathe between. The door slid, and a woman looked out. Tired eyes, steady flame. They bowed. They poured tea, and even the steam seemed to carry timid words. Her story arrived like a cartwheel printing damp soil. Each spoke a week of worry. Each creak a memory of a husband who now counted the neighbor's scarecrows as his own. He asked for names. The names contained fog and fish and the places where the river changes its mind. A story, like a wound, closes cleanest when it meets air without shame. so he did not hurry her. Crossing to the neighbor's veranda, he met a different silence, the stacked boxes of a family ready to move yet undecided where. The man bowed, not as deeply. A small cliff lived in his jaw. They spoke where the night could overhear and correct them if needed. Neither wanted the riverbank because it was rich. Each wanted it because it was memory. One father teaching a boy to fish, one wife braiding her hair in a reflection before pushing their child into the world. What do lines mean in a country where mist redraws the world each morning? And yet, hunger does not negotiate with philosophy. He asked for a rope, not to bind, but to measure. They walked to the river's edge, two men whose footsteps pretended not to hear each other. He staked one end at the fallen stone and drew the cord to an old reed both remembered from childhood games. A second rope made a small triangle whose corners touched the stories each guarded. Then he stepped into the water, to his knees, and laid his sword along a flat stone so the moon could lie down upon it. If the river wished to grant one man both memories, it would have pulled the cord to him already. It had not. The triangle stood. The ropes held. Their reflections began to braid in the current, becoming a thing not easily separated. Perhaps, he said, two griefs can grow without choking each other. Let the triangle remain as a shared path. Reeds uncut, egrets welcome, children free to step without trespass. Honor is not a wall, it is a gate that knows which way to open. The jaw's cliff softened, the bow deepened. A small wind opened through the reeds as if a door had been rediscovered where everyone assumed only fence. He lifted his sword. The moon rose with it, uncut. The woman came with tea, and they stood by a boundary that was also away. Peace, he thought, is perhaps only a place where you may set a cup down without asking permission. He returned up the lane so the settlement could be witnessed by sky. The temple bell did not speak, yet its silence glowed like a careful word after it has done its work. At the pine, the prayer tag ticked gently. He touched the letters in his sleeve and felt morning somewhere beyond the hills, rolling banners in their sleep, armor dreaming of rain. A fox stepped onto the path, considered him, then vanished, as if erasing a brushstroke to perfect the page. He breathed and remembered his vow, to move like weather, to arrive, work, and go, and to keep the blade a mirror rather than a tongue. Beyond the ridge, a road made of mist waited, already taking the shape of footsteps, of ink, of distant drums that did not threaten but simply called, steady as a heart that has chosen to listen. Dawn did not so much arrive as unfold. A pale ribbon along the horizon, drawn slowly through the fingers of the hills until it slipped into the village and softened every hard edge. He walked before the roosters found their courage, when dew stitched bright threads between the bamboo stalks and the world smelled of wet straw and beginnings. The triangle of shared reeds at the river had already welcomed two egrets. Their thin legs wrote brief calligraphy across the mirror of water, a script the current read and carried away. He paused there, not to admire his own solution, but to let the newness settle where conflict had lived, the way a potter lets cooling clay remember its purpose. The letters in his sleeve lay still, warmed by his body. Promises he knew prefer the quiet company of warmth to the spectacle of applause. He followed the path that braided rice paddies and vegetable plots together until it found the small dojo that belonged to no clan and yet to every honest hand. Its sliding door sighed like an old friend waking. Inside, the floor waited with the kind patience of polished wood. A single broom leaned in the corner, pointing to the day's first lesson. He set the broom to work, and as the straw whispered, the code he'd been taught rose in the mind like steam, unwritten yet exacting, a whispering that sifted his choices until they rang clear. Some call it law, others dress it in poetry. He knew it as a way of breathing. Honor that is loud is theater. Honor that is quiet becomes a road. Compassion that seeks witnesses is vanity. Compassion that seeks the wound is medicine. Courage without attention is only heat. Courage with attention becomes light. He swept as if each sliver of dust were a thought, and the floor returned him a calm bright enough to see by. Outside, the first apprentice arrived, a boy with eyebrows knit in permanent apology, his wooden sword carried as gently as one carries a sleeping cat. The warrior bowed. The boy bowed lower, and the day found its rhythm. They began with stillness, because stillness is heavier than any blade until the hands learn how to lift it. Do not hunt balance, he murmured. Let balance notice you. The boy's shoulders softened. Breath found its gait. They moved, then, not into strikes, but into listening, stepping as if the tatami were a shallow pond, and their souls must leave the water untroubled. The boy faltered. A rush of self-reproach rose and broke. The warrior lifted his hand, not to correct, but to invite a different question. "What is the shape of patience?" he asked. The boy looked outward, then inward, and could not say. "Today," the warrior said, "it is the length of this room." They walked it together, slow enough that morning had time to sit in all four corners and smile. Between forms, he spoke of the code as one speaks of weather, accepted, prepared for, never mastered. Rectitude, he said, is the straight path, but a straight path through living hills bends and bends again. Do not mistake the bend for betrayal. Benevolence is a cup of hot water with nothing added. Do not dismiss it because it is plain. Respect is a door with two hinges. It opens for you only as much as you open it for others. Honesty is the clear mirror that shows both scar and smile. Honor is the thread that keeps those mirrors framed. Loyalty is not a chain, but a bridge that you maintain even when no one crosses. And self-control. Here he paused, touching the hilt he had not yet unsheathed. Self-control is the gardener who decides which thoughts may bloom. Without it, even virtues tangle into a bramble that hides the path. The boy listened as a field listens for rain. They returned to movement, and the wooden swords found their voices, soft clacks, shy as chopsticks. On the third exchange, the boy struck too quickly, joy outpacing judgment, and the warrior let his own Bakken fall aside, stepping into the blow with open hands. The strike, robbed of opposition, collapsed harmlessly against the space he had offered. The boy stared, confused by an answer that did not match the question he thought he had asked. "Steel is not the only way to end an argument," the warrior said. "Sometimes the emptiness does it for you." He showed him how the body could fold like a reed and rise like a heron, how the foot could speak before the hand, how the face, composed, could calm a room faster than any order. Around them, the dojo grew brighter, and outside the world took up its honest chores. Women washing vegetables in wooden tubs, a carpenter testing a plane against a plank until shavings like curled moons fell to the ground, a cartman talking to his ox as if to an old friend. News arrived the way news prefers to arrive, with a modest cough at the threshold. An old courier with ash on his sleeves bowed, apologized to the dust he brought in, and offered a sealed strip of paper. The warrior thanked him with tea that steamed like a small blessing and broke the seal. The Lord's message was spare. A border village to the north had woken to banners it did not recognize and taxes it had not agreed to pay. There was still time for words, maybe only a little, but enough for a patient tongue. The boy looked at the letter as a child looks at thunderheads marching along the mountains, fearful and a little thrilled. The warrior folded the message and tucked it near the others, the way a monk returns a sutra to the shelf. He did not hurry. He finished the broom, and the sweepings looked like a small, harmless hill. Yesterday's worries made light. He closed the dojo with a bow, and together they began to prepare. Rice packed carefully, flints checked, sandals mended with patient stitches. In the lane, a woman pressed into his hand a bundle of pickled plums. In her other hand, she carried forgiveness for troubles not yet committed. He thanked her as if she had given him a talisman, because she had. As they walked, the boy finally asked the question that had been scratching at him like a sparrow at a paper window. "Sensei, if a man insults you and everyone hears it, does silence not make you small?" The warrior watched a drifting leaf choose a place to land. "Sometimes," he said, "a man's words are arrows he has made to fly only as far as his pride. If you do not stand where he expects you, they fall in the grass and trouble no one." The boy nodded, not convinced yet, but softened by the possibility. The road to the north unrolled like a scroll written by cautious hands. Willow shadows, bridges with planks that hummed underfoot, tea huts where old men argued gently about fishing knots as if the world depended on the right loop. At noon, they sheltered under a cedar and ate in silence that tasted of salt and contentment. The boy dozed, head against his pack, and the warrior let his own eyes close, not to sleep, but to smooth the creases of thought. He pictured the border village as one pictures a relative one has never met, half in detail, half in hope. When they rose, the sun had softened, and the road had taken on that late-day gold in which even scarecrows look philosophical. He spoke then, not to instruct but to keep company with the miles, of how the code is not kept in books because books can be burned. It is kept in gestures, how you set a cup down, where you place your feet when a door opens, whether your blade looks like hunger or like responsibility. And then, like a pebble slipped into a sleeve, he added something gentle for those listening beyond the path. If you, wandering far from this village, are awake with us now, tell me where you are from and what hour your night has chosen to be. If this quiet road keeps you company, perhaps subscribe to the entire history, so that our next candlelit journey will remember to find you again. The boy pretended not to hear, but he smiled into the collar of his robe as one smiles when a good song finds a listener. Evening gathered without argument. Crickets tuned their tiny instruments. The first star offered itself without price. Ahead, the border hills stood like folded screens, each ridge a brushstroke darker than the last. He felt the weight of the sealed letter and the unsealed hopes that always travel with such missives. Words, he knew, can be swords or bridges. His vow beneath the pine had chosen. He placed his palm on the hilt, not to draw, only to remind the steel that its finest use is restraint, and breathed in the cedar's cool, needle-green air. Somewhere down in the reeds of a far-off river, two egrets lifted, then settled again, as if rehearsing a piece that might yet be taught. And farther still, beyond the hills whose names he had not learned, banners turned in their sleep, listening, perhaps, for a voice that would arrive like weather and leave no wound behind. The border village did not wear panic on its face. It wore a careful patience, as if a mother had smoothed the wrinkles from a worried brow and told the day to sit quietly till help arrived. Smoke rose from cook fires in thin, undecided threads. The river, narrow but insistent, pinned the settlement to the hills like a silver hairpin. He and the boy crossed a wooden bridge that had been repaired many times. Every plank spoke of someone's steady hand. At the far end, a makeshift banner had been planted, a color not of their lords, a character painted with the haste of men who claim before they understand. A small knot of villagers stood near it, their postures tilted inward the way stalks lean together before a storm. A tax officer in lacquered sleeves sat straight-backed on a travel stool, a ledger open on his lap like a mouth ready to chew names. 2 guards flanked him, the light on their helmets sliding from bright to dim as clouds drifted by. The warrior bowed, not to the banner, but to the people whose breathing had grown shallow around it. The boy followed, his bow deep enough to speak without trembling. "Who sets this color here?" the warrior asked in a tone that invited dignity rather than demanded it. The officer raised his eyes with the expression of a man measuring a fisherman's basket for hidden eels. "A rightful claimant," he said. "New stewardship brings new order. You will pay for the river's obedience and the hill's consent." He tapped the ledger, and dust rose like an afterthought. The warrior studied the painted character, its brushstrokes impatient, its tail too long, as though pride had tripped and left a smear. "New stewardship," he repeated gently, as one repeats a child's bold word to see if it still stands when spoken softly. "Then surely it knows the names of the dead who planted these fields, and the dates when flood and drought traded seasons, and the place where the shrine fox hides in summer." The officer's mouth tilted, unimpressed. "Do not trouble me with village poetry," he said. "Coins speak all dialects." The boy's fingers tightened on the strap of his pack, but the warrior's hand floated a fraction above the boy's sleeve, a small moon offering the tide a calmer shore. He turned to the villagers first, for law without witness grows brittle. "Do any among you recall a proclamation, sealed and read, declaring such change?" Heads shook. The old carpenter, with hands fat with honest scars, cleared his throat. "We have heard rumors," he said, "but rumors are like crows. They say mine to anything that gleams." The warrior nodded. The river gave an encouraging flicker. He faced the officer again and asked for the seal. The man produced a broken wax disc. Impressed with a crest the warrior recognized but did not accept. A minor lord allied to their own, but with a reputation for reaching first and apologizing later, if at all. "A fragment says there was a hole," the officer shrugged. "Do you doubt it?" "I doubt only urgency," the warrior replied, "and I prefer to doubt it slowly." He requested permission to read the writ aloud, to let the paper hear its own voice. The officer, soothed by the theater of authority, allowed it. The writ was clever the way a fisherman's net is clever, wide in claim, fine in mesh, promising protection from piracy at the price of measuring every fish that passed. It referenced a border arbitration said to be in progress. It spoke of interim compliance. He folded it again and held it like a leaf he did not wish to bruise. "If arbitration is in progress," he said, "then the interim most pleasing to heaven is the one that does not bite. In tradition, villages under question are held harmless until judgment, lest a disputed coin become a cursed one." The officer sniffed. "Tradition is a warm blanket. The world is colder than your cloak." The warrior's eyes rested on the guards. Their helmets gleamed because someone had cared for them. Their grips were correct because someone had taught them. He addressed them without accusation. "You carry order on your hips." Where there is doubt, order ties its knots loosely and waits for proper hands to tighten them. One guard's gaze flickered, the way a candle trembles when a door thinks of opening. And then, as often occurs when pride begins to suspect it might be lonely, a small mistake presented itself. The officer had dated the writ to a day when the minor lord was known, by any courier worth his sandals, to have been 2 provinces away, attending a funeral feast documented by 3 temples and a drunk poet. Chronicles sometimes argue over emperors and eras, over which comet wrote which omen across which night, but they rarely miss the day 1,000 lanterns were lit over a river to send a soul downstream. The warrior mentioned this fact as one mentions the weather, apologetically, knowing it cannot be changed. "Your seal is not false," he said, "but your date is an orphan." The officer's mouth thinned to a line that would have preferred to be a blade. "The quill slipped," he snapped. "Quills do not attend funerals." The boy swallowed a smile and turned it into a respectful cough. The villagers stood a fraction taller, as if the air had returned to them. The warrior did not press the wound. He bandaged it with courtesy. "We are all subject to haste," he said. "Let us do as the river does, and consult the stones. Until the elder magistrates confirm, accept in good faith what was owed to the former banner last harvest, neither more nor less, and leave the writ with me to carry to the council so that its story may be finished properly." He set his palms together and bowed so deeply the ledger could see its own reflection in the lacquer of his helm. Silence became a field where a single choice might bloom. The guards looked to the officer. The officer looked to the road behind him, where dust and confidence might yet arrive. They did not. He exhaled through his nose, performing a small defeat that could pass for magnanimity. "Collect the former due," he told the villagers, as if the idea had been his all along. "We will return when the council has confirmed what I already know." He snapped the ledger shut. The banner bowed in an unkind wind. As they left, the warrior asked for a moment with the writ. He knelt by the shrine fox and traced, without smudging, the character that had been painted too long at the tail. "What is written in patience," he said for the boy alone, "fears no lantern." He returned the paper, and the officer, eager to be away from a village that had learned to breathe, took it and went. Relief does not announce itself with drums. It steals in like a shy guest and finds a seat near the hearth. Women returned to their tubs. Children took up games that had paused mid-jump. The old carpenter ran his thumb along a plane iron, as if reminding it that wood, not men, should be shaved thin today. The headman approached with gratitude folded into dignity, offering rice and pickles as if they were titles. The warrior thanked him and shared with everyone so that the thanks had witnesses. "Do not mistake today's reprieve for tomorrow's guarantee," he said gently. "Wind is a traveler. We must tie our roofs to rafters made of sense." He asked for 3 things: a copy of last harvest's accounts written by the temple scribe, the names of any messenger who spoke for the minor lord in recent months, and permission to sit with the eldest woman who remembered how disputes were settled when their grandfathers were young. The scribe came with ink still wet on his fingers and a nervous pride. The messengers' names were offered like pebbles that might one day bridge a stream. The eldest woman arrived wrapped in a shawl that smelled of cedar chests and careful folding. She told them that in her youth, when 2 banners could not agree, it was customary to hang both flags on the same pole at the village gate and let them share the wind until judgment. A guard from each side would sit together, eat from the same bowl, and record the day as one story. "When 2 men watch the same moon," she said, "the moon learns both names and prefers neither." Historians might argue whether such customs were born from necessity or wisdom. She made the argument unnecessary by being both. As afternoon took on the tender dust of late light, the boy asked if they had truly won. "We have delayed a wound," the warrior said. "Sometimes that is how healing begins." He walked to the river and let its voice edit his thoughts. The writ's date would be pressed between firmer facts. The council would listen if approached without vanity, but with evidence. And if vanity arose, as it does, then he would invite it to sit under the same lantern as duty and see which one cast the truer shadow. He felt the letters in his sleeve, the mother's wish for quiet harvests, the scholar's plea to cut rumor rather than flesh, and understood that every petition is a thread in a larger weaving. Night began to practice softly at the edge of things. Somewhere a bell rehearsed what it would say when darkness gave it permission. He turned to those who walked with them in silence across distance and hour, listeners whose rooms held the same hush as this riverbank. "If you are with us now, Tell me where your night is, what city or field holds your pillow, and what time your clock has chosen. If this candlelit road keeps your mind company, consider subscribing to the entire history so that these quiet journeys will find you again without knocking. The boy skimmed a stone. It skipped 3 times and accepted the 4th. How do we prepare for the council? He asked. By remembering that a blade is most convincing in its scabbard, the warrior said, and by letting truth arrive like water, persistent, unhurried, wearing down the stone not with force, but with continuity. He rose, and together they walked toward the headman's house, where a guest mat had been unrolled and miso warmed a clay pot. Behind them, the banners still flapped, but the wind had grown polite, and the river, deepening with evening, carried forward a promise that words could yet suffice. While somewhere beyond the hills, other banners turned in uneasy sleep, as if they, too, were listening for the footfall of a man who preferred gates to walls. Dawn washed the council town in a color like steamed rice, plain and comforting, as if the sky had decided to set a humble table for difficult talk. The road in had been quiet, willows leaning to confide, bridges humming their low wooden notes, and he and the boy entered through a gate that remembered more ceremonies than quarrels. Paper lanterns slept above the street, their ribs showing through like bones of small birds. They stopped at a tea house whose doorbell was only a string of shells. The clatter when it sounded was gentle, as though the sea were reminding them to keep their voices low. He laid out what must become a path. The temple scribes' copies of last harvest's accounts, the messengers' names written cleanly, the fragment of the writ with its orphaned date, and the old custom the village elder had spoken. 2 banners sharing 1 pole, 2 guards sharing 1 bowl. Evidence, he told the boy, is not a hammer. It is a lantern you carry ahead so that even those who disagree can see where their feet are about to fall. The boy nodded, excitement tugging at him like a puppy at a sleeve, and asked if truth always wins when shown politely. Truth is like water, the warrior said, warming his hands over a cup. It finds a way, but sometimes it takes the long road around the stone. In the council hall, the mats were brushed, and the alcove wore a scroll of mountains wearing hats of cloud. A single peony in a low vase pretended not to listen. Magistrates entered with faces practiced into pawns. A clerk sat ready, brush poised, his ink like night waiting for stars. The minor lord's envoy appeared with the lacquered calm of a boat that has never met a storm. Silk neat, crest neat, a precise smile that measured everyone and approved no one. The envoy bowed to the hall, to the scroll, almost to the peony, and not quite to the boy, which told the warrior a great deal. Words began with greetings that matched emotions. Palms together, a breath, a careful placement of sleeves. The envoy spoke first, as power prefers, naming interim stewardship and stability levies and the necessity of swift compliance. His voice was a reed, cut at a sharp angle. Water could pass, but not without a scratch. The warrior answered with the plain bowl of facts. He offered the accounts, stamped and witnessed. He offered the messenger's ledger. He offered, without accusation, the lantern of the funeral feast with its 1,000 river lights and 3 temples, and one inconvenient poet who had catalogued the evening with graceless enthusiasm. He even offered a small apology on behalf of quills that sometimes slip when carried by men who walk faster than their thoughts. The magistrates listened with the professional politeness of trees in light wind. The envoy's smile narrowed. Dates, he said, are a matter for scribes. Sovereignty is a matter for banners. He moved to produce a fresh writ, this one properly sealed and timed to today, and laid it on the tatami like a brand new law hatched from a warm pocket. The warrior did not flinch. If 2 men claim to have planted the same tree, he said mildly, Let them both sit in its shade until the oldest ring agrees.
In our villages, we hang both banners on the same pole while elders examine the roots. This neither insults authority nor indulges anarchy. It lets the winds speak to both equally. He placed on the mat a small wooden pole from the tea-house garden and, with a craftsman's respect, tied to it 2 handkerchiefs borrowed from the clerk, one red, one white. The peony seemed to approve by doing nothing at all. A magistrate with eyebrows like snowdrifts leaned forward. "Custom is a kind of memory," he murmured, "and memory is the spine of order." Another magistrate lifted the envoy's fresh writ, weighed it as if it might confess a motive, and set it down again.
The envoy's calm showed the tiniest seam. "While banners share a pole," he said, "may the interim levy be collected to ensure security." The boy shifted, but the warrior's breath steadied the room. "Security is best ensured by not sharpening hunger," he said. "Let the former due stand. No more, no less, until the council's ruling. If more is taken at noon and returned at dusk, the rice still remembers the hand that scooped it." He spoke of the river village where egrets had accepted the triangle of reeds. He spoke of the rope that measured stories. He spoke, and here the clerk's brush paused, of how a blade is most convincing in its scabbard. Then he offered what pride rarely expects: help.
"If men wearing the envoy's color sit the gate with men of the former color, eat from the same bowl, and record one story under 2 seals, I will train them to bow to the same moon." A silence fell that did not feel empty. It felt like a cup waiting to be filled. The magistrates conferred in voices only slightly louder than moth wings. The clerk breathed in a way that made the peony's leaves tremble.
At last the chief magistrate spoke. "Banners will share the village gate, levies to remain at the former rate, accounts audited in 3 days by a mixed ledger team, the envoy's writ to be considered upon correction of its genealogy, the warrior to liaise, the boy to observe as witness for the next generation." The envoy swallowed his disappointment with admirable posture and bowed a bow that might ripen into respect if given weather. "We accept the council's wisdom," he said, meaning, "we will return, but also, perhaps, we will learn."
Outside, the town's sound returned. Vendors offering chestnuts, sandals gossiping with the dust, a cat deciding to forgive a bird that had been foolish but not quite foolish enough. The boy exhaled the way a flute does when the player finally remembers to breathe from the belly. "Did we win?" he whispered. "We prevented a loss," the warrior answered. "Victory is often only the absence of regret." They walked back toward the river, where the reflection of the council hall unrolled itself like a scroll, and then rolled itself up again when the wind changed its mind.
He thought of the scholar's letter about rumor, a blade asked to cut breath instead of flesh, and understood that councils do not end rumors. They starve them by feeding truth, daily, in small, sincere meals. He remembered the mother who wanted no hooves in her harvest, and promised, silently, that both banners would sit still while rice turned from green to gold. Evening gathered its shawl, and with it that old companion voice that walked with them wherever lantern light met the edge of sleep, the listeners in far corners whose rooms heard the same soft footsteps. "If you're with us now, perhaps tell me where your pillow rests and what hour your night has chosen. If these quiet roads are good company for your thoughts, consider subscribing to the entire history so that this candlelit journey knows the way back to you." The boy skipped a stone. It found 5 brief footholds, then accepted the river's opinion. "Sensei," he said, "if they return with sharper papers?" The warrior smiled toward the first star. "Then we will return with steadier hands. Ink dries, rivers keep moving. Which one do you trust?" They shared a bowl of noodles at the tea house with shell-bell doors. The broth tasted like patience warmed. When they rose to go, the host pressed a small lacquered pole into the boy's hands, the practice standard for the gate, so that two handkerchiefs might learn to share the same wind. Far in the hills, banners turned in their sleep. Slower now, perhaps listening, as the night stitched one more thread between law and mercy, and the river kept teaching anyone who would watch how to move forward without breaking what it touched. Morning arrived as a slow brushstroke, pale and deliberate, laying a quiet sheen across the gate where two colors now learned the same breeze. He stood with the boy beneath the practice standard the tea-house keeper had lent them. The handkerchiefs, red and white, fluttered like two birds that had decided, after a brief discussion, to share a branch. The newly paired guards were awkward at first, each greeting a mirror he did not expect to meet in uniform. The lacquer on one helmet recognizing its reflection in the other and pretending not to. He began not with drills, but with tea, because tea is the grammar of cooperation. Cups passed hand to hand until the line of men breathed at the same pace, and then he spoke softly about standing, of how a post is a promise the feet make to the heart, that they will not run away before the mind has done its work. They practice stillness as if it were a kata, eyes softened to include rather than exclude, hands resting near hilts in a way that said not, "I hunger," but "I am ready to hold back." The boy walked the length of the gate with a bundle of rice cakes, offering one to each guard, and marking, privately, whose fingers trembled and whose steadied at the second bite. His ledger was not ink, but attention. When the sun rose above the tiled roofs, he changed the lesson. "Turn," he said, and they turned, slowly, outward, away from the gate and toward the village they served. "Remember who is behind you," he added. "Today it is not lords, it is roofs, it is cooking smoke, it is children learning the shapes of letters by tracing water on wood." A few men swallowed, and their shoulders lowered by the width of a sigh. They began a second kata, one he had learned from a teacher who believed forms could be prayers in disguise. Step and see, step and hear, step and let go what is not needed. Perhaps, he thought, historians will argue one day whether such small mornings ever mattered to banners. Some will say treaties carve borders, not tea, and authority comes from paper, not posture. Let them argue. Paper tears, tea returns tomorrow. Posture, repeated, becomes a custom that even stubborn hills begin to imitate. He dismissed the men at noon with tasks that braided their colors. Pairs assigned to walk the market lane, to stand at the shrine and dust the fox's bib together, to sit with the temple scribe while he added today's tale to yesterday's ledger. With the boy he crossed to the rice fields, where wind rehearsed its steps across the grain, and dragonflies practiced swordplay in sunlight. The headman met them carrying a ledger tied with simple cord. He spoke of a rumor that had survived the council, a shadow that claimed the envoy's men were allowed to collect gifts so long as they named them blessings. Rumor is a patient thief. It takes a coin here, a favor there, and before anyone says the word tax, a new habit has rented a room in the village's breath. He took the ledger and read not just entries, but the spaces between them. The days when chickens were sold and not recorded. The sudden prosperity of a cousin with no known shop. The temple's donation jar growing generous exactly when a certain pair of sandals was heard at dusk near certain doorways. He felt the scholar's letter in his sleeve, its request as gentle and stubborn as a stream. Draw the blade not against flesh, but against a whisper that eats trust. So he went to the market where fish blinked philosophical eyes on shaved ice, and cloth sellers arranged colors like careful arguments. He did not ask the question rumor loves, who pays whom for what, because rumor is fed by its own name.
Instead, he bought a small comb and asked the comb seller, an old woman with a voice like rice straw, to explain how she priced a thing that must both flatter hair and survive a dowry chest. She spoke of grain and patience and the corners that crack under careless fingers, and by the time she finished, 3 bystanders had joined the discussion and corrected her kindly on a detail or two, and each had mentioned, as if by accident, the men who called gift what felt like a measurement of fear. He thanked them, left the comb, and carried their words to the shrine where he knelt as one kneels to tie a sandal before walking far. He asked the boy to invite the paired guards, one from each color, to meet him there at twilight. Twilight came the way sake warms a throat, slowly, with honest intention. The guards stood uncertainly under the fox who had seen many generations attempt wisdom in a hurry. He placed before them the practice standard, handkerchiefs now touched by the day's dust, and spoke without verdicts. If a blessing is asked for, it is a blessing. If it must be guessed, it is a fee. If it must be feared, it is a theft. He showed them the ledger's gaps, not as accusations, but as empty bowls waiting to be filled with the right story. One guard stiffened. His partner's hand, resting at his side, flexed in an old habit that wanted a hilt. The boy stepped forward with rice cakes again, broke one in half and shared it, then another, until the rhythm of taking turned to the rhythm of giving back. The stiff guard exhaled, and confession arrived without trying to be noble. A sergeant had encouraged gratitude, nothing formal, only enough to remind the village who watched the roads. He thanked the man for honesty, the rarest thread in any cloth, and asked where the sergeant sat when night grew too honest to lie. The answer carried them to a tea shed by the northern path, a place where travelers' coins were heavy and their news light. They went at once, because delay is the scarf rumor wears to seem fashionable. The tea shed's paper walls were the color of old teeth. A cricket lived under the step and had opinions. The sergeant sat with 2 others, cups arranged like little fortifications, voice low and smooth as if sin were a song best sung in a minor key. The warrior entered as a customer, bought 3 cups for strangers and 1 for himself, and studied the lacquer of the table until the sergeant studied him back. "We drink to the gate," the warrior offered. "May it keep both colors honest." The sergeant's smile carried a draft. "Honesty is a luxury," he said. "Roads are not paved by poetry." The boy, who had learned to measure silence, let this one stretch until pride stepped into it and tripped. The sergeant mentioned gifts without prompting, and in the mention made them law in his mouth. The warrior did not correct him. He asked instead if the blessings had receipts, because blessings without receipts become fog, and fog becomes cliffs. The sergeant laughed, the kind of laugh men use when they hope to make a circle around what they fear. Then the warrior placed on the table the practice standard, the 2 cloths touching, a reminder that wind belongs to no crest. "Tonight," he said, "I will stand the gate with you, and you will teach me how a blessing is invited so that all can see its face." The sergeant's eyes hardened the way river mud tries to become brick. "We collect at our discretion." "Then teach me discretion," the warrior replied, "for I am a slow student, and my teacher beats me when I fail." The sergeant looked for a way to turn the moment into theater, and found instead the boy's patient gaze, which did not accuse so much as ask whether this performance was worth tickets. He snorted, tossed a coin, and rose. "Come then, Master of Cups," he said. "Let us ensure the wind respects both flags." At the gate, night gathered its arguments. A peddler with lanterns, a farmer late from threshing, a courier whose sandals wanted to be home. The sergeant tried to conjure a blessing from the peddler's fear. The warrior tilted the lantern gently so its light fell on both handkerchiefs and said, "Name your gift before it is asked, so that it can be refused without shame."
The peddler named it, cheap and honest, and the warrior refused it with a bow and a story about how the moon sometimes chooses to shine freely to confuse wolves. With the farmer, he asked for a proverb rather than a coin. The man gave one about roofs and rafters, and they recorded it in the scribe's book as payment that would live longer than copper. With the courier, the sergeant reached too fast, and the warrior's hand, open, not hard, found his wrist, guiding it down the way one returns a sword to its scabbard without nicking the mouth. Discretion, he said softly, is the art of leaving a man's dignity standing when you walk away. The sergeant's jaw worked. A storm wanted to be born and could not find its mountain. At last he muttered that gifts would be Sunset's business no longer. Morning would claim them by name or not at all. It was not a confession. It was a small, useful surrender dressed in authority's coat. They stood until the east grew tender again. The ledger held a proverb, a promise, and 3 refusals. The tea shed's crickets slept. He felt the mother's letter warm against his sleeve, and thought of fields untroubled by hoofbeats, and knew that sometimes a rumor is best unmade by daylight with witnesses who remember how it began. He turned then not just to the guards and the boy, but to those traveling with them in the hush between lamps and sleep, the listeners whose rooms breathe the same slow air. If you are with us now, tell me where your night is, what city listens with you, and what time your clock keeps for your dreams. And if this gentle road keeps you company, perhaps subscribe to the entire history, so that these quiet vigils will find you again without knocking. The boy leaned the practice standard against the gate. The 2 cloths stirred together, shy, then sure, and somewhere beyond the hills, banners shifted in their sleep, uncertain whether to dream of drums or of the faint, stubborn song of a village learning to share its wind. The day opened with the soft rasp of a whetstone, a sound like rain learning a careful language against the eaves. He rose before the boy and set a small basin on the veranda, laid the blade across a folded cloth, and let the light find it in thin, patient strokes. Oil breathed a quiet scent. The steel replied with a sheen that refused to hurry, a river deciding which stones to praise. He was not sharpening for battle. He was reminding the edge who it was, and who it must not be. The boy woke to the whisper of stone and watched from the doorway as a student watches the tide, curious, a little reverent.
"It is the hand that becomes sharp first," the warrior said, "or else the hand becomes hungry." When the steel had taken enough light to be honest, he rapped it again and took from his sleeve the scholar's letter, creased now with miles. Rumor had been answered at the gate for one night. That is not the same as forever. He felt in the paper a gentler request, still unresolved, to cut not breath, but the root that feeds breathless talk. Perhaps the root was not in mouths at all, but in a certain emptiness that villages know between planting and harvest. The hour when hands are too tired to work and too awake to rest, when words become toys for the unsupervised mind. "Ink first," he murmured, "then steel." The two go together more often than the world admits.
They walked to the temple where the morning bell wore its own echo like a shawl. In the sutra hall, sunlight came through shoji and became paper itself, and the abbot, a man whose eyebrows looked like phrases waiting for the right sentence, sat with a calligrapher from the next province, invited for the season to restore old vows. On the tatami lay sheets of mulberry paper, bowls of soot-black ink, and a brush that had known slow winters. The calligrapher bowed with a humility that did not put itself on display. He had a swordsman's shoulders and a scholar's wrists. His hands did not tremble but also did not pretend to be stone. He welcomed the boy with a smile that made room for mistakes.
"A brush," he said, "is a sword that must leave all its wounds beautiful." The warrior bowed in return, sensing at once the kinship. To draw a line that convinces the air to stay drawn is not so different from drawing a blade and convincing the room to remain unharmed. He asked to sit and learn how vows might be written so that even wind would hesitate to tear them.
They ground ink carefully, the boy turning the stick in the shallow stone dish until fragrance rose like a memory of fire. The calligrapher dipped the brush, lifted, breathed. The stroke began before it touched paper. The body had already decided to be a river, the spine a bank to guide it. The line appeared, not merely black, but alive, thick where meaning needed weight, thin where meaning wished to pass quietly. Character for honor, the calligrapher said, is only a field fenced by patience. The boy tried. His first line stuttered, a road with too many inns. He frowned, then caught himself. The warrior's silence held him steady. Again, the calligrapher offered, as if you are listening with your wrist. The second line arrived with fewer apologies. Outside, wind took a polite sip from the temple's eaves. The abbot spoke then, not as judge but as weather. Men argue whether a blade shapes character or character shapes the blade. He smiled at the gentle argument he had invited. I have seen poor men made worse by steel, and poor steel made better by men. Which is more true? The warrior considered the sword asleep beside him and the brush that had just breathed a vow into paper. Perhaps neither truth is whole, he said. Perhaps a blade is a question that asks what is already there. The answer is the road a man walks after he sheathes it. The abbot nodded. The calligrapher's eyes warmed, as if someone had poured tea into them. Historians might still argue in 100 winters which truth was larger, tool-shaping soul or soul-shaping tool, and perhaps both will carve clever essays. But the morning, patient and small, chose to carve lines that might change a single afternoon. When the boy's characters learned to stand without leaning on his hope, the calligrapher brought out a scroll older than anyone in the room. Its edges wore the brittle grace of autumn. The vow written there was simple: to speak last when anger speaks first, to walk first when fear walks last, to return sharpness to the stone before sleep. A village forgets such sentences, the calligrapher said, until they are put where eyes must meet them. The warrior understood. He asked permission to carry copies to the gate, the tea house, the market's ledger post, places where rumor reaches for its shoes. The abbot granted it with a bow that felt like rain deciding to be generous. The boy rolled the fresh sheets carefully, guarding them from his own eagerness. They left the temple by the north path, where a low pavilion watched the river pretend to be a mirror. On a bench sat an old sword polisher with a face like good leather and a patience that had survived at least 3 kinds of pride. At his side rested the tools of his quiet art, stones finer than any insult, papers soft as confession. He recognized the warrior's blade by its restraint. He recognized the boy by his effort. Sit, he said, and no one disobeyed him who wished to keep the day. He unwrapped the blade, not to improve what did not need improving, but to speak to it in the only language steel trusts, contact and time. A sword, the polisher whispered, working through grits that felt like weather turning seasons, is honest in a way men admire and fear. It shows you exactly the face you carry to it. Most look only once. The boy leaned forward, then checked himself. The warrior's breath steadied the bench. The polisher inclined his head toward the rolled vows. Ink can do a thing stones cannot. It can walk. But stones do a thing ink cannot. They teach slowness until even impatience falls asleep. He handed the blade back with reverence that was not worship. Keep it bright enough to refuse lies and dim enough to forgive clumsy hands. They hung the first vow at the gate where the 2 handkerchiefs had learned to share their nerve. The guards read it under their breath as if teaching the words to the ribs. One laughed softly at the line about speaking last, not because it was funny, but because it had been waiting inside his mouth like an unclaimed parcel. At the tea house, the shell bell approved with its little ocean. The host placed the vow where sun and steam would copy it into passing shoulders. In the market, the vow went up by the scales where fish winked at everyone's conscience, and one seller of sweet bean cakes told his daughter to read it aloud until it tasted like truth. Not everyone approved.
A man with an important purse sniffed that paper cannot stop hands. Perhaps he was right. Paper does not stop. It invites. And sometimes invitation is the one force pride cannot admit it fears.
Afternoon went gold, then quieter gold. By the river, he and the boy practiced with Bakken, letting wood speak without bruising. Brush first, he reminded, and had the boy breathe a single character in the mind before each step. The strikes grew less loud, more exact. The wind moved through the reeds with the faint confidence of a teacher who knows a lesson will take root tomorrow, not today. Between exchanges, he asked almost to himself whether peace requires spectacle to be believed. The river replied with its ordinary voice. Dragonflies pretended to argue, then changed the subject. Perhaps, he thought, the grand victories historians prefer are only fireworks that make good paragraphs, while the victories that keep roofs untroubled are more like proper sweeping, daily, unnoticed, indispensable. Evening began to stitch darkness to the hems of things. At the gate, the paired guards arranged their posture so that night might learn something from them. In the market, the vow collected small signatures of agreement in the form of coins not taken. At the tea house, a traveler paused to copy the words onto his sleeve to carry them over another hill. The boy, tired in the righteous places, asked if writing vows did not tempt hypocrisy. It was a clever question, the kind that tests whether ink is vanity. It tempts it, the warrior said, and that is why we practice with stone and wood first. A vow is a mirror that follows you. You cannot dodge it by closing your eyes. He touched the blade's wrapping, felt the calm alive in the cloth, and imagined the pine where all this had begun, still catching moonlight like coins no tacksman could take. They walked back toward the guest mat the headman had offered, carrying the empty basin, the ink scent, the memory of strokes that had decided to be gentle. Behind them, the vows did their quiet work, and the village breathed as if a belt had been loosened after a long meal. Far in the hills, banners turned in their sleep, perhaps annoyed by ordinary goodness, perhaps comforted. And somewhere between brush and blade, as lanterns found their places and the first cricket tuned its string, a thought arrived that did not require an answer. Maybe the true edge is not the one that cuts. It is the one that reminds the hand to be kind before it is strong. The knight accepted this without debate, and the road ahead, patient as paper, waited for the next line to be written. Night had rained itself thin over the roofs, and by morning a light like rice milk pooled in the alleys, smoothing the splinters of yesterday into something the hand could trust. Yet from the north road there came a sound that did not belong to kitchens and brooms, the slow approach of hoofbeats that knew their own weight too well. He and the boy were at the shrine gate, straightening the vow where steam and sunshine had curled its corner, when the first rider appeared. A man whose armor did not match itself, lacquer chipped to the color of old cherries, a crest rubbed nearly blank by other men's journeys. Behind him followed three more, and then a cart with its canvas drawn half down like an eyelid refusing to wake. Travelers, one might say, but the first man's posture spoke a different grammar, chin written in declaratives, hand hovering near his hilt as if the day might forget its manners and need reminding. The paired guards shifted. The red and white handkerchiefs at the practice pole made a small, uncertain breath. The rider dismounted with ostentatious care, the kind that pretends to be courtesy while counting how many eyes follow. He gave a name that was probably true and a title that was probably not, and announced his business with the even tone of a man inventing law as he walks. "Inspections," he said, "for the safety of banners and the purity of roads." He asked for the ledgers, then for a private word with the headman, then, almost an afterthought, for a small road sweetening to hasten the paperwork. Rumor, it seemed, had learned a new accent and bought a horse. The boy glanced up, seeking the pace set by the older man's breath. He found it steady, and so his own steadied too. The warrior bowed to the rider as one bows to a guest who has yet to earn tea. "Inspections love daylight," he said, "and ledgers love witnesses. You shall have both." He invited the travelers to the market square, open as a palm, and asked the temple scribe to bring his brush, the guards to stand in pairs, the headman to fetch the accounts that still smelled faintly of last year's sweat. If authority must perform, he thought, let it perform on a stage where truth can see the lines. The rider's eyes flicked to the cart. "We carry a seal," he added, tapping the canvas with the back of his hand. "From a friend of a friend whose name travels faster than ours." The canvas did not answer. The old carpenter, passing with a length of cedar on his shoulder, stopped and set it down as one sets down a witness. "You will find the peony of the council freshly painted on several papers," he said mildly, "if paint can comfort you." The rider smiled with only half his mouth. "Paint is for fans and brides," he said. "We prefer wax." The square filled the way a field fills with wind. Quietly, in every stalk, the scribe unrolled his sheets. The boy placed the practice standard where the banner ghosts could find a fair seat. The guards formed a single line with room between each pair for thought to pass. The rider presented his seal, a boar engraved with such enthusiasm that its snout looked like a threat. The warrior did not dispute the metal. He asked the date again, and the route by which the seal had come, and whether its keeper dreamed of funeral lanterns or of taxes, questions that seem like courtesies until they are answered. The rider grew impatient. He tried to summon the old trick of hurry. That little cloud of dust authority kicks up to blur the feet moving beneath it. "We should not trouble peasants with ceremony," he said. "Your council will approve. Let us demonstrate efficiency." He gestured to the cart as if it housed a verdict. "Open it," the warrior said, not sharply, only with the ease of a man asking a friend to remove his shoes before stepping onto clean tatami. The canvas fell back. Inside sat chests lashed with rope and a lacquered box wrapped like a secret. Not unlawful, the boy thought, but at a distance, correctness can resemble rightness the way a scarecrow at dusk can resemble a man. The rider lifted the box and placed it on a low stool. "Receipts," he announced. "Stamped. Or will be when the village shows its gratitude for secure roads." The warrior watched the box, which did not sit quite flat. One corner had a habit of testing the air. "A good box," he said, "knows its own patience." He asked the scribe to examine the stamps. The scribe, who had learned to touch paper as if it could bruise, found impressions that were nearly right. Nearly. The peony's outer petal lacked its smallest notch, the way a liar's story lacks the detail no honest man would think to invent. The warrior did not cry fraud. He asked for water. He poured a little on the stamp and pressed it again. The notch failed to appear. Perhaps the carver's hand was tired, the rider said, a little too quickly. Historians like to argue whether forgery is the child of desperation or pride. Perhaps both are the same parent on alternate days. The warrior let the village watch his hands, open, deliberate. "We will provision you," he said to the riders, "as we provision all who pass. Rice, water, mended sandals if needed. For the box, it will be happiest at the council hall, where peonies know their own faces." The rider's courtesy narrowed to a wire. You accuse men who keep you safe on roads. Your lord does not always afford to patrol. The warrior did not glance at his sword. He glanced at the vows posted by the scale stand, where fish eyelids had learned to forgive small mistakes. Safety is a road, he said. It is built from both ends, and when it is finished, it does not charge a toll to those who laid the stones. He invited the rider to sit, to share a bowl, to let the scribe make 3 copies of what was to be done, each stamped by dawn's honest light. Pride rarely eats when invited to a public table. The rider declined the bowl and instead tried one last door. Your boy, then, he said, casual as a cat. Let him accompany us to the next border post as witness, and we will complete our business on the road. The boy felt the town tilt, the suggestion that thinned the space between safety and leverage. The warrior's voice did not harden. It sank, like a pebble choosing the truth of a well. He is already witness, he said. Here. The square agreed by continuing to breathe. The rider laughed, but a laugh made from angles cannot stay long in a round place. He gestured to mount, but one of his own men hesitated, eyes lifting, just a glance, to the practice standard, to the 2 little cloths that had learned the same wind. Perhaps he remembered a village like this one. Perhaps he was simply tired of clever boxes. He cleared his throat. If the papers are true, let them be truer at the hall, he muttered, choosing a road that looked less dramatic, but more likely to reach evening without stains. The rider's look could have dulled a whetstone, yet numbers were not on his side, and neither was the daylight. He performed a bow that insulted no one, and promised nothing, snapped the canvas back into place, and allowed the cart to turn toward the council town. The square exhaled. Relief did not dance. It sat and held its knees and looked at the vow as if reading it for the first time. The headman asked softly what had been won. Time, the warrior said, and time is the only ally that can teach truth to walk without tripping. He asked the guards to escort the riders to the first milestone, not as prisoners but as guests who had overstayed. He asked the scribe to write exactly what he had seen, naming no villain the sun had not caught in the act. He asked the boy to carry the lacquered box with both hands, because even lies deserve to arrive unbroken if they are to confess properly when opened. Afternoon thinned into silver. The old polisher, passing with his bundle, nodded to the blade he could not see and to the brush he could. Some edges, he said to no one in particular, prefer to be used on rope. The boy smiled at that, and the warrior felt the pine of the first night move in him again, the way vows are weather, not thunder. Later, when the cart had become a memory the road would retell in dust, he and the boy walked the fields, whose egrets practiced punctuation across the surface of water. If they return with soldiers? The boy asked. Then we will return with neighbors, the warrior said, and the boy seemed to understand that this was not defiance but a kind of architecture. Evening found them on the ridge where a breeze arranges the village in the nose. Straw, broth, ink, and the sharp, almost hopeful scent of iron that has remembered restraint. He thought of the debates scholars loved, whether a single man can change a town, whether customs are born from one afternoon or 100 patient ones, whether paper placed in the right doorway can prevent a blade from being drawn in the wrong one. Perhaps the answers are as shy as deer. Perhaps they step out only when we stop trying to capture them and simply keep the forest quiet. Below, the practice standard clicked its small wooden music. The handkerchiefs breathed together, red and white. And far beyond the hills, banners rolled over in their great sleep, frowning at a morning they had not planned, the kind of morning built from bowls, ledgers, and the stubborn, unglamorous decision to open every box in the square where everyone could see. Rain arrived without argument in the night, stitching the fields to the sky with a thread so fine that morning wore it like a secret. By the time he and the boy set their sandals to the lane, the puddles had settled into small, patient mirrors where swallows came to practice their handwriting. The cart with its lacquered box had already taken the road to the council hall, escorted by paired guards who looked less like colors now and more like the same thought spoken in two accents. He did not follow at once. Instead, he walked the village as a gardener walks in the hour before guests, touching, straightening, letting small things confess themselves. At the shrine, the vows paper had curled like a sleeping cat. He smoothed it with 2 fingers and felt how ink keeps company with days the way a good roof keeps company with rain. In the market, fish blinked their salt-bright eyes, and the seller of sweet bean cakes put an extra one in the boy's hand, as if rewarding both patience and appetite. The headman met them by the scale stand with a look that had learned to trust silence. He reported no new demands, only ordinary talk baking into bread, the safe gossip of prices and weddings. This, too, was a kind of victory, the sort that historians rarely write down because it doesn't bleed in interesting shapes. "Steel?" the boy asked softly, meaning, "Are we done with ink for now?" "Ink sharpens steel you can't see," he answered. "But yes, today the visible blade will stretch its legs." He had promised the old polisher that he would visit the forge at the edge of the village where a widow tended coals with the authority of someone who had learned grief's temperature. They found her beneath a roof where smoke and memory had signed a treaty. The anvil waited with a dignity that needed no polish. She bowed to the sword, as one greets a guest whose reputation is both earned and misunderstood. "I can do little," she said, "but sometimes little enough is exactly what is needed." She unwrapped the blade and listened to it the way a midwife listens, by placing care where words would only clutter. A touch of stone here, a prayer of paper there, the faintest tap along the spine as if to remind it to carry weight without complaint. "Edges forget," she murmured, "when they are praised for too long." The boy watched fire-red metal. He watched the woman's shoulders write patience into heat. Outside, the rain negotiated with the eaves and then decided to be kind. When the work was done, she offered them river water in cups that had learned to hold without clinging. "The council will open your box," she said with a smile that had seen many doors. "May it open itself first." They took the north path after noon. The hills lifted like folded screens, each ridge a darker brushstroke, and in the dips between, rice paddies held pieces of the sky as if the day had broken and they were helping carry it. A scarecrow, hat tilted like a philosopher's, kept its pointless watch and seemed content with that. The boy walked with the new confidence of someone whose questions had begun to arrange themselves into corridors rather than corners. "Sensei," he said after a time, "if a man means well but does badly, which part do we bow to?" He smiled into the road's quiet. "Both, and neither. The bow is for the effort that can be taught. The correction is for the harm that cannot be allowed to stay. And if he will not be taught, then we bow to the future he endangers and make a fence of firm hands." The answer did not settle everything, and it should not. Some questions are rightly left to walk beside you like a polite companion who refuses to enter the house until you have aired the rooms. At the first milestone, a fox stepped onto the path and sat, as if auditioning for a fable. Its tail conducted the rain's time, and then it left them with the grace of something that knows when it has already said enough. They reached the council town before evening, lanterns not yet lit but thinking about it. In the hall, the clerk's brush waited like a caged moth. The magistrates wore faces set to attentive weather. The lacquered box stood upon a low table, its corner still testing the air, that small impoliteness which had told the truth before. The truth had agreed to be told. The envoy from the minor lord had not yet arrived. Rumor said his horse had found reasons to be thirsty at several streams. He and the boy bowed. The chief magistrate returned it with the slight fatigue of a man who dreams nightly of peonies and wakes to paperwork. "Will you open it?" the clerk asked, too politely for his eagerness to hide. He did not touch the lid first. He touched the rope, thick, well made, but tied by hands that knew knots as theater, not as devotion. He untied without flourish. Inside lay a sheaf of receipts, their seals honest at first glance, and beneath them a set of blanks, waxed but unstamped, like intentions shopping for opportunities.
There was also a shallow tray of small pebbles, each marked with a brush dot, white stones that remembered the weight of pockets. The boy lifted one and frowned. It smelled faintly of the dye used by toll collectors along a different road 2 provinces west. The magistrate, whose eyebrows resembled snowdrifts, leaned closer. "Stones for counting?" he asked. "Or for throwing," another murmured, implying neither crime nor innocence, only a human habit for which he had too many examples. He set the stones aside and asked the scribe to place the stamped receipts beside known good ones. The peony's missing notch presented its case without more drama than was necessary.
"A near truth," the chief magistrate said, which is another way to say a useful lie. The envoy arrived at last, his silk wet, his smile too dry, and made an effort to be charming. He professed outrage, tempered by surprise, a blend brewed for halls such as this. "Someone," he said carefully, "has borrowed our reputation." "Then you will be eager to help return it," the warrior answered, making space for dignity to choose the honest chair. The envoy chose it. Perhaps out of calculation, perhaps out of a tired respect for days that had not yet wronged him. Men were sent to fetch the rider with the chipped lacquer and the cart that had traveled too quickly between villages. They would arrive by moonrise. Meanwhile, the hall practiced the art of waiting without wasting. He and the boy slipped out to the veranda where rain had become a patient mist. The town smelled of steamed straw and the iron sweetness of a river that pretended to be modest. Across the street, a forge sang to itself in low vowels. Farther down, a woman taught a child how to fold paper into a crane that might remember joy when it was time to become ash. "If they claim ignorance," the boy said, meaning the riders, and perhaps even the envoy, "do we forgive?" "We forgive as often as we can," he said, "and we guard as often as we must. They are different verbs with the same root." The boy turned this over like a coin, felt its edges, put it in the pocket of his attention. Lanterns bloomed. The riders were brought in, wet and sullen, their arrogance damp as a dog. The man with the chipped lacquer attempted a grin and found none of the room's faces interested in being grinned at. The box told its story with the tired voice of a tool misused. The receipts with missing notches confessed simply by standing next to those whose notches had not been misplaced. The stones smelled like West Road dye whether or not anyone wanted them to. The magistrates did what good carpenters do, the least precisely. Fines enough to make memory honest, escort back to a garrison that would recognize its own negligence. A note to the minor lord, whose envoy bowed lower now, learning that pride survives best when it practices humility under supervision. He asked for one thing more, that the riders, before leaving, stand 1 hour at the village gate where red and white learned the same wind. Unarmed, bowls in their hands, giving water to passers-by and receiving nothing but thanks. The hall paused. The chief magistrate considered the strangeness of punishments that mend what they break and nodded once. The envoy agreed, perhaps because he sensed the usefulness of a lesson that could be told later as his idea. And so, under a sky rinsed clean, the men who had come to sell safety poured it instead from ladles into the hands of farmers and children, and the boy counted that hour better than any he had spent with a blade. "Will it last?" he asked as they walked back toward their guest mat, rain having finished its letter to the earth. "Nothing lasts," he said softly, "except the habit of trying again. That is the only empire worth serving." They passed the practice standard. The cloths breathed together. In the paddies, frogs began their honest choir. Somewhere beyond the ridges, banners turned in their sleep, perhaps less certain that noise was the same as power. And in the village behind them, ink dried, edges rested, and the vows, unable to sleep by design, kept watch the way quiet things keep watch, by reminding even the wind to be gentle when it can. The morning after the rain wore a new quiet, the kind that sits lightly on the eaves and lets the sparrows write their brief memoirs without interruption. He and the boy walked the levee path where the river, newly serious after its long conversation with the clouds, carried small branches like thoughts it had decided to keep. The village breathed with an ordinary courage. Laundry strung like flags of peace, a cooper rolling a barrel the way time rolls a year. The fox at the shrine blinking as if it had forgotten a dream it meant to remember. It would have been easy to decide that calm was finished work, sealed and delivered. Yet calm is only a guest if the house never sweeps, and he had woken with the knowledge that somewhere beyond the ridges, a different grammar of order was being conjugated in the imperative. On the veranda of their lodging, where towels warmed like sleeping cats, he unwrapped the blade not to sharpen it, but to read it, as one reads a well-used poem, seeking which syllables of duty still rang true and which had grown sentimental through repetition. The boy brewed tea with the careful clumsiness of someone who knows that a spill can become a lesson if it bows quickly enough. They drank in silence while the steam wrote advice the room pretended not to understand. Then the headman arrived with a letter whose string wore a knot tied by hands that respected rope. The seal was their lord's. Sun pressed into red wax with a restraint that promised clarity rather than heat. He broke it, and the words within leaned forward without shouting. A summons to the coastal road where a train of tax rice had vanished between milestones like a lantern snuffed by a polite thief. Witnesses disagreed whether the culprits wore rags or crests. Some swore to bandits who spoke with the courtesy of monks, others to samurai who apologized to the grain as they lifted it. The Lord's writing admitted doubt aloud, which is the first gesture of wisdom. He asked for inquiry with the blade sheathed, urged speed without hurry, and added, uncharacteristically, a small splotch where the brush had paused longer than ink prefers. The boy read over his shoulder and grew taller in all the places that did not show. "We go," he said, as if the verb had only one tense. "We go," the warrior answered, and the day began to pack itself for distance. Rice wrapped in leaves, plums that remembered salt, sandals whose thongs had learned forgiveness. Before leaving, he walked the market once more, touching the vow near the fish scales where eyes like beads continued their patient blinking. Words do not guard gates, a skeptical merchant had murmured the first week, and yet the gate had guarded itself precisely by finding words to stand beside it. Perhaps both were true, and truth lived most comfortably where two chairs shared one mat. He left a bow with the shrine, a word with the polisher, a look with the practice standard whose cloths lifted and fell together like a single breath with two lungs. Then they took the eastward track, a road that remembered salt in its bones. Hills stepped aside one by one, and the sea announced itself first by smell, the clean iron of distance, then by sound, waves applauding a story they already knew, then by the sight of boats drawing calligraphy against a page of light. At a headland shrine, a fisherman paused in his knot and told them how 3 nights past, 20 koku of rice had taken a walk without permission. The thieves had bowed, polite enough to be insulting, and had left behind a proper bundle of coins, equal to what a fair tithe might have been, pinned under a smooth stone as if to pin the truth. Thieves with accounts, the boy said, frowning into the mathematics of morality.
There are bandits who steal and bandits who edit, the warrior replied, and they both let the sentence sit while gulls rearranged the air into ordinary greed. They tracked the rumors like footprints through damp sand, noting where prints deepened, fear, and where they smudged, embarrassment. A tea seller whose ladle told time better than any bell remembered the color of a sleeve, indigo with a patch shaped like a crescent. A toll-keeper recalled a voice that refused sake with a monk's apology and asked for water with a soldier's certainty. Historians will argue whether evil prefers masks or mirrors. The day, practical, suggested it prefers whatever door is open. By dusk, they came to a pine spur overlooking a cove where rocks wore moss like old armor. In the hollow below, rice sacks rested in a neat row, as if waiting to be forgiven, and 3 men knelt with their swords unbound, backs straight, heads lowered, as though listening for a verdict from the tide. They were not ragged, they were not gleaming. Their armor carried the modest honesty of field work. Their crests were old enough to be shy. He descended without haste, the boy at his shoulder, and the men raised their eyes. The eldest spoke for them, voice steady in that way men learn when they have rehearsed their guilt. "We have taken what was worming in the storehouse," he said.
"We have paid what would have been owed rightly if rightness had survived the road. We kept back what would have molded if hoarded by men whose ledgers eat more than their children. If judgment must arrive, let it." The sentence tried to be noble. Nobility is a robe that sometimes hides bruises. He asked where the rice would go. "To villages beyond the cliff path," the eldest answered, "where taxes have learned to be teeth." The boy looked from sacks to faces and struggled to place the word justice where both law and hunger could sit. "Who taught you to do arithmetic with hunger?" the boy asked, not unkindly.
"Hunger," the man said, "and fathers whose hands had nothing left to sell but patience." The warrior listened for the sound that often walks behind such confessions, the rattle of vanity, but he heard only fatigue braided with stubborn principle. Yet fatigue can be a generous disguise for pride, and principle, unattended, grows splinters. "You have chosen an enemy who is easy to hate, and a method that is easy to admire," he said. "That combination breeds stories that walk faster than truth." He stepped to the nearest sack and pressed his palm to the cloth. Beneath it, grain yielded the way crowds yield to a procession they both respect and resent. He spoke then of the council town, of the envoy who learned to bow at a reasonable angle, of vows hung in markets that did not stop hands, but taught them to think twice before wandering. "If we make a road from exceptions," he added, "the road will refuse to carry ordinary feet." The eldest studied the tide's slow kneeling and rising. "We meant to embarrass greed," he said at last. "We did not mean to unhouse order." "You have not," the warrior replied softly. "Not yet. But a single thoughtful theft becomes an academy if left unexamined." He proposed terms. The sacks would travel to the cliff villages under a banner of permission, escorted by witnesses with clean brushes. Accounts would be copied at each stop, signed by farmers and by the men who had called themselves editors. A letter would go to their lord, his own hand, naming both the mold in the storehouse and the arithmetic that had walked these sacks down to the sea. "And punishment?" the youngest asked, not angry, only serious in the way the unscarred must learn.
"You will pour water for travelers at the gate of the coastal town for 7 days," he said, remembering another hour in another place, "and you will listen to what hunger sounds like when it tells the truth about itself." The men accepted, perhaps relieved that their courage could become something other than theater. He turned then to the boy and offered the question that had to be asked. "If the Lord refuses our letter?" The boy looked out across the light where boats pulled ink from the horizon. "Then we sharpen patience first," he said slowly, and steal only if patience dulls where lives would be cut. The answer did not please him. It made him responsible. That is how good answers do their work. Night gathered as if drawing a shawl around the hill. In the cove, the sacks waited like well-fed monks. Far along the headland, a bell practiced its evening. They made camp beneath the pine's polite branches. He wrote by moonlight, brush careful, naming truths without teaching them to swagger, asking for audit rather than absolution, praising the envoy's earlier grace as if to invite more of the same. He sealed the letter with a thumb that refused to tremble and gave it to a courier whose sandals had outlived 2 wars and 3 wives and had learned not to comment. Sleep came with the measured breath of someone counting steps before a bridge. The boy whispered a question into the blanket of the night. Will stories tell the truth about this? And the night, courteous as always, declined to guess. Somewhere behind them, in a village that had found a way to hang 2 colors on one pole, vows kept their vigil. Somewhere ahead, beyond the headland where the sea wrote patience against stone, drums might yet wake. Between those somewheres, the road curled like a brushstroke waiting for meaning. And when wind changed, the pine above them answered with a small, approving shiver, as if the forest had decided, for one more day, to trust in gates more than in walls. Morning unscrolled from the sea like pale silk, and the cove where the sacks had waited now held only their footprints, the neat depressions that rice leaves in sand, small moons declining to be permanent. He and the boy took the cliff path with the 3 men who had called themselves editors, moving village to village as agreed, letting brushes do the difficult lifting that shoulders had begun. At each gate, accounts were copied, seals pressed, names spoken as if summoned from sleep, and a bowl of water offered to anyone who could teach the day a gentler word. The rhythm steadied nerves. Even suspicion, which travels faster than couriers, found itself pausing to listen when it met the patient consonants of ink and witness. Some elders praised them with guarded eyes. 1 or 2 scolded them with a relief that sounded like rain finally choosing the thirsty field. By the 7th sunset, the rice had been placed where it would be eaten with gratitude rather than hoarded with argument. And the men, bowls in hand, had learned that service strips rhetoric the way a river smooths stones, slowly, thoroughly, without applause. That night they slept under pines whose roots held the cliff as sternly as any law, and before dawn a courier found them, sandals salted with road, a letter tied in the style their lord preferred when clarity wished to arrive without flourish. He broke the seal. The brush had been honest. It admitted rot in the storehouse and rot in the habit that had allowed rot to sit undisturbed. It praised the escort of rice under banners that did not lie. It condemned the hands that had learned to call neglect order. It asked them to return inland by a mountain road where a problem with sharper elbows waited in a town that once braided reed mats for shrines, but lately had learned to braid rumors into ropes. There is talk, the letter said, of a sword school with proud floors and hungry books. Their graduates bow well but listen poorly. They collect students as a storm collects gulls, and their fees are heavy in the mouth. The boy traced the characters for hungry books with his finger as if feeling the grain in a piece of wood. Can learning starve? He asked.
When it eats praise instead of practice, the warrior answered, wrapping the letter with the tenderness one gives to a truth that may be hard to keep.
They climbed into hills whose backs were stitched with cedar and whose ravines held narrow cabinets of mist. The road there speaks in fewer words. Feet must supply the rest. At a bend where a small shrine kept watch over a fall of water, thin as flute music, a young man waited with a sword at his hip and a vacancy in his eyes that suggested an argument had been rehearsed too often in solitude. He bowed, as precisely as a clock marks an hour, and asked to walk with them for the improvement of his horizon. The boy accepted the phrase twice, once as poetry, once as warning. They walked until the road widened into fields given over to hemp, and then the young man confessed the name of his school, a name the wind had already carried to many doorways. House of the Plum Noon, founded by a master whose drawings of cuts were said to be so perfect that the brush itself had learned to flinch. "He teaches the heart to be a blade," the youth said, with the satisfaction of someone who has found a sentence that behaves like a talisman. "Does the heart agree?" the warrior asked. "It is not asked," the young man said, and for the first time his practiced cadence faltered. "We are told the world grows dull unless we sharpen it with ourselves." The warrior listened to the water folding itself over stone, to a hawk writing a parenthesis above a pine. "There are dull things that beg for an edge," he said. "There are also soft things that hold the world together. A heart is soft by design." The young man flushed because the sentence entered him where drills had not. He requested, in a tone almost modest, a demonstration, a taste, he called it, of the older man's school. The boy tensed. He had learned what requests sometimes follow when pride hears its own echo. The warrior set his pack down, untied the practice pole from its cords, and planted it in the soil. "Here is my school," he said. "2 cloths, 1 breeze. Stand until you can feel both." The young man's mouth made a small blade of disappointment, and then, to his credit, closed the scabbard of his impatience and stood. For a time the only noise was the field arguing gently with the wind. At last he exhaled something like respect, or at least interest. "Our master says stillness invites defeat," he offered. "Our master says stillness chooses its battles," the boy replied, surprising himself. By afternoon the town appeared, roofs sewn tight against rain, streets crossed by the shadow lines of banners whose dye had remembered too well how to be read. The school stood near the river on ground that wanted to be market but had been trained to be parade. Its gate wore a plum carved so meticulously it had forgotten how to be fruit. Inside, young men moved as if auditioning for a chronicle. Their drills were calligraphy without paper. The master emerged to the sound of sandals, choosing who they respected. He was neither tall nor thin. He had chosen the build of a man who expects to lift other men's certainty like buckets. His eyes were unblinking in the way of those who have taught themselves that blinking is a concession. He bowed, efficient as a tax, and spoke of technique as a monarch speaks of borders. "Travelers beg us to harvest bandits," he said, offering both pride and charity in the same breath. "We will, for a fee. We will train your boy for a fee. We will instruct your lord's magistrates in the difference between decisiveness and delay, also for a fee." The warrior bowed deeper, and the room experienced the slight disorientation that honest humility produces when it appears in a place accustomed to rehearsed deference. "I came to ask whether your school's hunger has outgrown its bowl," he said gently. The master smiled with the patience of a pit. "We plant excellence," he said. "Excellence is thirsty." Historians will argue whether excellence can ever be blamed for the thirst of those who sell it. The day argued slightly that merchants of any virtue must mind the weight of their own scales. The warrior made a request that sounded like an insult only to those who had forgotten. That questions can be lanterns. "Will you let your best student practice with an old man whose knees have learned to predict rain?" The master accepted. Pride rarely refuses a stage. They met on packed earth checked by faint prints of boots and the deeper stories of wooden sandals. The chosen student was not the hungry-eyed youth from the path, but another whose posture had learned how to be both respectful and sharp. They bowed. The boy stood off to one side, hands observant. No steel left its home. Only Bokken, unpainted, honest, touched the air. The first exchanges were brisk, the kind of clever conversation that too quickly forgets to listen. The warrior yielded where he was expected to bite, stepped where he was expected to root, and, when the student's joy began to outrun his judgment, offered a vacancy that swallowed the strike like a well taking a stone without complaint. A hush found the room's edges. "You wasted an opening," the master said to the student, voice mild and unsparing. "He offered one," the student answered. Bowing to both men at once, the warrior lowered his bokken, letting joints offer their small, accurate complaints. "Openings," he said quietly, "are sometimes gifts wrapped around a lesson. The lesson is why you were not harmed." He asked to change partners, not to humble, but to widen.
The hungry-eyed youth from the path stepped forward, shame and hope jostling like brothers. They moved, and this time the older man spoke as they moved, telling the boy to watch not the hands but the decisions, not the cuts but the breath before cuts. The youth attacked with a narrative he had been given in a room without windows. The warrior answered with an ellipsis. At last the youth saw it, the space between intention and contact, the little meadow where choice grazes if invited, and he lowered his weapon first. He bowed as if the floor had just recalled his name. Something shifted in the watching students, less a cheer than a tide going out to show what it had been covering. The master's jaw made a quiet opinion of granite. "Our fees," he said, "are posted by the gate." "Your fees," the warrior replied, "are realities. But your graduates must carry more than cuts into a village. They must learn to leave with fewer enemies than they arrived with." The master's eyes sharpened. "Enemies weaken a nation." "So does loneliness dressed as superiority," the warrior said, and for a breath the room tasted the metallic risk of saying such things aloud. Debate might have soured, pride might have prepared its standard, but a bell chose that moment to ring from the riverside. 3 notes, the district's old signal for a broken bridge. The drills loosened. The master glanced at the door, burdened by both reputation and obligation. The warrior bowed to the tide turning underfoot. "Let us go mend something that will not pay us," he suggested. The master hesitated, then nodded. Students ran like rain does when it remembers where to be useful. At the bridge, a mid-span beam had lost its argument with swollen water. Carpenters shouted courteously. Ropes asked for hands that trusted them. Swords were ridiculous here. Wood and sweat and attention built the only grammar the river would accept. He and the master took opposite ends of a lever. The boy ran lines with a speed that will never be famous. For an hour, excellence was a shoulder underweight, and fees were forgotten. When the span settled back into its rightful sentence, the town exhaled as people whose feet have been granted future crossings often do, quietly, as if thanking the boards would embarrass them. Back at the school, the master stood longer than ceremony requires. "We will review our ledgers," he said at last, carefully, as if carrying heat. "Hunger is not an argument," the warrior answered, "but it can be a teacher." The hungry-eyed youth bowed to the practice pole they had carried, and the cloths, 2 colors sharing one weather, lifted with evening. The road out of town smelled of cedar and a vow recently reminded of its work. Beyond the black slope of hills, banners did what banners do. They turned in sleep with the restlessness of ambition. But that night, their dreams were troubled not by enemies, but by a bridge that had accepted a beam set by many hands, and by the disconcerting possibility that victory might sometimes sound like boards agreeing with water to hold. They left the town with its mended bridge and its school of polished certainties just as twilight began laying lavender along the river's edges.
and the road curved into uplands where pines stand apart like old friends who have learned to speak with pauses. The boy walked lighter, not because the miles had grown shorter, but because a question had taken root and begun to drink, whether strength is the scream of a blade or the patience that keeps it from needing to sing. The air smelled of cedar and the faint iron of distant rain. Somewhere, a nightjar rehearsed its single, stubborn note. He carried, as always, the letters tucked in his sleeve, creased by sleep and weather. Yet tonight they felt less like orders and more like promises he had agreed to keep on behalf of people who had not yet learned the right words to ask. When darkness gathered, they chose a shelf of rock that remembered being warm in the afternoon, and they made a small fire, careful as a secret. The boy, watching sparks attempt the stars, asked whether the bridge had taught the school more than any kata could have done. "Bridges teach what opponents forget," he said, breaking the rice cakes in half so they would taste like generosity. Weight, timing, the humility of grain, and that standing under another's burden is unbeautiful and therefore often honest. The boy nodded the way young trees nod when wind teaches them both bowing and return. They slept with the quiet of men who have held a rope that did not break. Morning took its time. It arrived like a guest who tidies the house before anyone wakes. They followed a trail that flirted with ravines and then thought better of it. And by noon, the path widened into a plateau where a single hut studied the horizon with the concentration of a monk reading weather. Smoke from a twig fire rose in a thread without fray. He knew the place at once, though years and miles dim ambition's ink. It was the hermitage of his old teacher, the man whose cane had once touched his shoulder the day he learned that not all victories wear banners. A low bell sounded, the kind that refuses to carry farther than it needs, and the door slid aside. The teacher had grown smaller, the way mountains grow smaller when you learn the paths through them. His eyebrows had taken on their own opinions. He bowed as if every vertebra had a story it wished to tell, and then forgot. Tea came, the simple kind that forgives even clumsy hands. The boy held the cup like a promise he did not yet understand. Silence did the first work. Then the teacher asked with the courtesy of rain whether the world had learned patience or merely new costumes for haste. The warrior answered that some banners had learned to share a pole, and some blades had remembered the elegance of remaining asleep. The teacher smiled into his sleeve. "Then you have been editing sentences," he said. "Do not forget to teach grammar to those who write laws." The boy tried to hide his grin and failed. The teacher noticed and let him keep the triumph. They spoke of roads and rice and the recent theater of false seals. The teacher listened with the economy of one who keeps cupboard and conversation equally free of clutter. "Vanity makes poor soup," he said at last, "but it is remarkable how often people try to live on it." He poured a second round. The steam wrote kanji in the air and refused to translate. "Do you know," the teacher added, "how to sheath anger without dulling it?" The boy tilted his head, the question startling him into honesty. "No," he admitted, "not yet." The old man nodded approval, the rarest commodity. "Then walk with your anger as if it were a child who insists on carrying a knife. Let it hold the scabbard, not the blade." They ate pickles that had learned wisdom from salt and sat until afternoon took on the low, obliging light that makes even rocks seem thoughtful. Before they left, the teacher placed in the boy's hands a small brush wrapped in cloth that once belonged to a pilgrim. "Write before you strike," he said, "even if only in your mind." The ridge road turned south, shouldering into hills shaped like sleeping cattle. On the third day, they saw smoke on a far slope. Black, vertical, impatient. Not cook-fire smoke, not charcoal smoke. The boy quickened. The warrior did not. They approached a hamlet that had been badly taught by fire. The roofs had failed their promise. The shrine's fox sat charred and indignant. A well bucket lay like a broken character on the ground. There were few people, and those who had stayed wore the stiff calm of those who do not yet know where to put their sorrow. An old man with ash on his eyebrows explained that the blaze had started in the magistrate's storehouse, where confiscated goods were kept for equitable redistribution, a phrase that very nearly persuaded him to give up listening to language altogether. Who lost what? The warrior asked, not about objects but about dignity. Everybody, the old man said, but most of all the clerk who had memorized the ledgers and now cannot prove he had a soul. He found the clerk sitting by a wall that had fallen with great ceremony. The man's fingers kept moving, adding numbers no longer required by the world. He knelt the way one kneels to mend a child's toy that will break again and asked gentle questions. The clerk's answers were dust. Still, the dust held shapes. A confiscation scheme dressed as civic virtue. A list of names with the wrong season written beside them, collectors whose zeal had learned to wink at its own reflection. Fire or accident, the boy asked when they had walked the perimeter and the wind had told what it could. Fire learns, the warrior said. It studies our habits. This one took 2 steps we taught it. He pointed to the broken path between the storehouse and the magistrate's dining room, to the neat stacking of brush that had no business being tidy in a drought. The villagers murmured their respect for such seeing, and then waited with that peculiar hope humans keep for someone who arrives with a sword but uses sentences. They began with brooms. Ash yields best to humility. The boy, the clerk, and the widest-shouldered farmer swept in lines that became lanes, that became a square, where people could pretend, briefly, that order had only tripped and would now continue. He asked the headman for paper, the coarse, forgiving kind, and had the clerk write what he could still count: households, births not yet registered because fire refuses to acknowledge birthdays, debts that had been paid twice because pride had not wanted to argue. We rebuild with the smallest truths first, he said, or the larger ones have nowhere to sit. Toward evening, a messenger arrived from the district town with shoulders that carried bad news carefully so it would not spill. The magistrate had taken responsibility for the accident by resigning and retiring beyond the hills with his family and his habit of keeping the wrong things. He had left a letter full of apologies that did not know the names of those they addressed. The villagers were content to be content. Punishment is a luxury when roofs need remembering, but the clerk began to shake, a man watching the last anchor cut from the boat he had called justice. The warrior placed his hand on the ledger the fire had spared in the clerk's mind. Some resignations, he murmured, are a kind of theft. We will ask the council to make tired virtue do something useful before it sleeps. He asked for 2 wagons of timber at the magistrate's expense, for his household to serve at the village pot until the first replastered wall had learned to keep out rain, for the store of coin rescued from the dining room to be counted by the clerk in the square, where everyone could see his hands, and for the magistrate himself to stand at the gate with a ladle if he wished truly to learn the temperature of regret. A few men laughed, not cruelly, only because mercy can sound like a trick to ears trained by harder music. He will not come back, someone said. Then we will ask his seal to come in his stead, the warrior replied, and we will put it on wood and rice and the sweat on these men's backs. He sent the boy with a letter written harder than he liked, and they spent the next day teaching the square to remember its shape. Children carried tiles, women cured clay with a patience that turned anger into bricks. The clerk began to speak in whole sentences again. At dusk, a wagon arrived, then another. Timber, rope, lime, the embarrassing generosity of a man in flight. Under a lantern, the clerk counted coin onto a table until numbers became music that everyone could hum. It was not enough, and also it was a beginning. The boy returned with word. The magistrate, cornered by his own conscience and the council's unforgiving arithmetic, would come. He would bring his seal and his household, and, astonishingly, no guards. The village received the news without applause. Relief, when it has learned caution, ties its hair back and goes to the well.
He came the next morning, not shaven clean of blame, but bearing it like a bundle he had not figured out how to set down without harm. He bowed in the square where his dining room had been the night's favorite joke, and did not attempt a speech.
The warrior placed a ladle in his hand as simply as one hands a cup to a thirsty traveler. "Start here," he said, "end nowhere. Between, listen." The magistrate dipped and poured, and the boy watched the strange alchemy by which a man begins to change shape one repetition at a time. Perhaps historians will one day argue whether this was justice at all. No chains, no public wailing, only the long arithmetic of repair. Let them. The roofs went up. The fox at the shrine received a new bib stitched from a woman's sash that had preferred happier work. The clerk wrote names that would not burn, and when evening brushed the ash from the hills and set it in the river like an apology, the village found itself breathing as if a belt had loosened. They left at dawn, because dawn is best at forgetting without lying. The magistrate kept pouring, the clerk kept counting, the brooms kept turning ash into floor. On the ridge, wind braided the grasses into a rumor of music, and the boy asked what they had won. "Another day when swords could rest," the warrior said. Beyond the next hill, faint and patient, a drum began to test the skin stretched across its frame. Not yet a call, only the memory of one. And somewhere past that, in a valley the road had not named, banners were unrolling for reasons that preferred shadow. The path took the curve, and the pine ahead leaned in as if ready to hear a vow that had not yet decided which words it needed. The next valley wore a hush that was not peace. It was the kind of listening a field does when it knows hooves are considering a visit. He and the boy followed the path down through switchbacks stitched with wintergreen until a town revealed itself. Low walls, a river splayed into shallows, a watchtower that had learned to look patient even when its knees ached. The drum they'd heard from the ridge had not decided to be loud. It was being thoughtful, testing the skin as a singer tests a room. At the gate, a farmer with sleeves rolled to the elbow raised his chin not in challenge but in warning. Visitors find us at inconvenient hours.
In the market square, benches were stacked like unsung verses. Doors wore the posture of mouths that had been told to keep still. On the notice board hung a proclamation with the minor lord's crest and a tone too proud for its paper. Levies increased for the urgency of security. Roads to be partnered by armed patrols whose loyalty had been measured in coin. A second paper fluttered beside it, plain and unfussy. Ink hurried but clear. A counterstatement from the council, invoking investigation, forbidding new collections until testimony met daylight. Between the two, a wind argued gently. The boy read both and felt the tug of war in his ribs. "Two voices," he said.
"Which one keeps the roof dry?" "Often the one that remembers the rafters," the warrior answered, tracing with his eye the grain of the wooden board, as if the tree that had become it still wanted to speak. A woman at a stall selling pickled burdock leaned in with the courage of a mother whose pantry has practiced hope before. "They are coming to escort the toll house," she said, sour humor lining the word. "Escort has learned to mean open our drawers." By noon, a column appeared along the river path. Riders first, then men on foot wearing the minor lord's color. The envoy among them, face composed as lacquer. Alongside walked a cohort of village men the warrior recognized by their shoulders and the way they kept an eye on their own feet. Pressed into service or persuaded, it hardly mattered. The envoy dismounted with proper angles and bowed to the square as if asking it not to embarrass him. Interim compliance has grown too interim, he said, voice sending its practiced ripple across the stones. Until the council completes its leisure of inquiry, we will secure the tolls to prevent discourtesy, bandits, accidents, the usual thieves. The boy's hand found the practice pole in their bundle. The warrior's breath reminded it how to be weather, not thunder. He stepped forward and bowed to the envoy as to a neighbor one hopes to greet for years without ever being invited to share a fence. The council's paper forbids new collections, he said, and lifted the plain notice, thin but with a stubborn spine, until testimony meets daylight. The envoy allowed himself a measured sigh. Daylight is agreeable to all who dress for it. We too prefer clarity. He gestured to a lacquered chest carried by two men, twins in posture if not in face. Let the tolls dwell here, he proposed, under dual seals, ours and yours. Each coin's rest will be watched by two colors. The square, which had learned to eavesdrop without appearing to, shifted in the way of a room that wants to applaud, but is trying first to count the cost.
Historians will argue whether compromise is the art of civilization or its slow undoing. Perhaps both arguments are true, depending on who keeps the ledger and who owns the lamp. The warrior examined the chest, better made than the last, with hinges that did not imagine themselves to be mirrors. Dual seals, he said, have an appetite for humility. They choke on hunger. He looked to the villagers, then to the men conscripted into uniform. He named 3 from the square, a scribe with a bad knee, a brewer known to water nothing, and the burdock seller whose eyes could measure a lie from across a river, and asked them to stand as witnesses at the toll house from dawn to dusk.
He named 3 from the envoy's line whose helmets fit like habits, not costumes. 6 eyes, he said, and a ladder for truth to climb down when it's tired of shouting. The envoy's mouth tilted between displeasure and relief. He agreed, because to refuse would have made his lacquer crack. Yet the drum that had been thoughtful decided, as sometimes happens with instruments and men, to find its courage at the wrong moment. A shout from the path above the toll house, horsemen, not in the envoy's color, crest blurred by dust and the sort of zeal that disdains punctuation. They had chosen a clever hour, the square mid-breath, decisions mid-sentence, hands mid-bow. Arrows arrived like crooked handwriting. People scattered. A cart turned itself bravely into a barricade. The burdock seller pulled a child by the sash and became for a heartbeat a door. The envoy swore, very softly, in the dialect of men who lose arguments at home. The warrior did not draw. He lifted the practice pole and planted it at the toll house corner. The boy tied the 2 cloths with a speed that will never earn a ballad, and the flags found the wind together, red and white discovering they liked the same sky. He shouted not orders, but directions that felt like remembering. Low behind stone, then 2 steps, there. You, lead the donkey into shadow. You, with the bell, 3 notes to the council hall. He pointed, not to enemies, but to places where fear could go and not make the day worse. The envoy's riders wheeled. The village men, shoulders, feet, all their complicated loyalties, held a line that was more sentiment than geometry. And sometimes that's enough. The first raiders hit the narrow and found it narrower than their speed. One went into the shallows with a splash that taught his pride the taste of river. The boy grabbed a fallen spear not to thrust it but to bar a doorway, and a woman with a broom executed an opinion about cavalry that future historians may fail to honor in their books. A pause, breaths lining up awkwardly, and in that pause the warrior walked straight into the shallows, water cold to the shin, robes heavy with unimportant dignity. He lifted both hands, empty, to be sure they could be seen, and said in a voice that had learned how to carry without accusing, This toll house is a bowl. Take your fight to a place where cups are not counting thirst. The raiders' leader, young the way knives are young, laughed through his nose, a sound meant to make the water blush. Bowl, cup, coin, who chooses which vessel spills? His men fidgeted. The envoy's line bristled. The boy thought he saw what his teacher had taught him to look for, the breath before the decision, the small meadow where choice grazes if called by its name. Tell me, the boy called, surprising himself, how much rice is in anger? Heads turned, because an honest question is as disruptive as a thrown stone but less likely to bruise. The leader blinked as if rain had arrived without his permission. Enough, he said, and even his horse seemed offended by the poverty of the answer. Then you will go hungry, the warrior replied, because this valley has chosen to eat differently.
He nodded to the envoy without looking at him, as one nods to a neighbor at a funeral to move the chairs without waking grief, and the envoy, finding perhaps the usefulness of that small dignity, lifted his hand for his archers to lower their bows, then raised the other for the village men to do the same. It is difficult to argue with a valley that refuses to perform your script. The raiders tried briefly to improvise. Improvisation lost interest. They retreated in the way men retreat when they hope their horses will make it seem like turning was a strategy. The drum did not boast. It let the river applaud.
Afterward, stones went back to being stones. The child the burdock seller had saved fell asleep clutching a broom straw as if it were a talisman. The envoy wiped his brow with a sleeve expensive enough to resent sweat and inclined his head to the pole where red and white had found the same breeze. Your bowl, he admitted, held. Because hands remembered what bowls are for, the warrior said. They walked the toll house together, counted what had nearly been taken, and recorded it without embroidery. Dual seals were pressed, not to bless coin, but to bind memory. Then came the quieter work, the sort future chroniclers may ignore because it lacks banners. Chairs pulled into shade for the elders who had stood too long, water poured without asking names, the proclamation board cleaned and given room for a third paper, written by the brewer's square hand, stating the day's agreement in words, plain enough to fit into a pocket. The envoy remained as sunset practiced at the edges. I am told, he said carefully, that your patience is not infinite. It is not, the warrior agreed. It is sharpened daily. That is different. The envoy nodded toward the hills where his lord's banners slept through plans they thought were their own. I will carry this day, he said, to a room where it will either be welcomed or treated as a rumor. Perhaps rooms can learn. Rooms do, the warrior said. Doors are slower. The boy asked, when the envoy had gone and the square had begun to remember laughter, if peace today had been nothing more than a trick performed by weather and luck. Peace is often weather and luck, he said.
But it is also scaffolding. We build it for the next storm.
They slept on the watchtower floor, the boards speaking in the polite creaks of old wood. In the middle of the night the boy woke, not from fear but from a thought knock-knocking like a traveler at a small gate. Sensei, he whispered into the dark, what if one day both papers on the board are wrong? The warrior listened to the river rehearsing morning. Then we will be the third paper, he answered, written by hands everyone can see. Dawn came with the smell of wet reed and bread beginning. The practice pole's cloths, stiff with night, learned the wind again and relaxed. Far away, beyond the next shoulder of land, banners turned in their sleep. And somewhere between those dreams and this square, a new letter began to walk toward them along the road, tying its string with a knot that respected rope, carrying either trouble or trust, two travelers who often share the same sandals before they choose their names. The letter found them at mid-morning, when the square had settled into that honest steadiness of small work. buckets passing, shutters mended, a child practicing bows to a fox that had never forgotten patience. The courier's sandals were the color of roads that keep their secrets. The string on the letter wore a knot that knew the difference between haste and urgency. He broke the seal and felt the brushstrokes lean toward him like reeds answering wind. The council called for witnesses to a summit at the border fortress 3 valleys east, where the minor lord and their own would exchange courtesies and clarities, under watch of monks who owned nothing and therefore could count more precisely than most. The envoy, it seemed, had carried yesterday's scaffold to a room where doors finally remembered how to open, yet the message carried a second thread, thin but old. The fortress had once been a monastery before it learned how to wear armor. Its stones remembered chants, but its arrow slits had discovered how to listen with less compassion. "We will walk," he said, and the boy, who had learned to agree with his breath rather than his mouth, tightened the strap of their bundle and looked at the practice pole the way a man looks at a friend who will be needed. They left the watchtower and took the road that trimmed hedges without insulting them. Willows rehearsed the idea of rain. A river settled old arguments with stones. Along the path, a woman in a reed hat knelt in a ditch and coaxed water into obedience with a stick, conducting its small orchestra of obedience toward a stubborn field. "You carry a pole like a shrine," she observed, smiling without interruption. "We ask it to remember wind," the boy said, and she nodded as if he had described something useful about marriage. The hours turned the color of steamed rice. Distant cicadas tuned their instruments. The hills lifted and folded until a gate appeared, whose lintel had known both prayer scrolls and command banners. The fortress sat as if it had been placed by a careful child, assembling stones, a little too proud of its straight lines, a little surprised by how many sunsets it had inherited. Monks in undyed robes tended a garden that insisted vegetables and tranquility grow from the same dirt. Inside the outer court, benches stood in a square that wished to be a circle. The envoy waited near one corner, lacquer more subdued than yesterday, an exhaustion on his shoulder that did not request sympathy, but would not refuse it if offered. A magistrate from the council, the one whose eyebrows had turned patience into punctuation, stood with a small ledger bound in indigo thread. Beside him, a monk arranged cups in a pattern that made mischief impossible. Opposite, the minor lord's steward, an older man whose loyalty had been worn into him like a pathway, held a sheaf of papers with the careful distaste of someone who prefers his truths boiled, not raw. He and the boy bowed to each, then to the empty air between them, because empty air often makes the most reliable witness. Words were set down like stones across a stream. The steward spoke of turbulence along roads, of unlicensed tolls, he did not say ours, and river banditry, he did not say yours, of responsibilities that grow like vines and require pruning. The magistrate replied with ledgers that wore their stamps like modest jewelry, with names of villages that had learned to hang 2 colors on one pole, with a receipt chest whose hinges had only recently discovered honesty. The envoy surprisingly chose humility as if testing a new season, acknowledging missteps born of overconfidence, a phrase that volunteered to be corrected. The monk poured tea. Tea did what tea does to sharp nouns. Speech softened at the corners. Then a younger voice, unexpected, a captain of the minor lord's guard, clean jaw, hard wrists, the kind of posture that turns principles into furniture, asked permission to display a map. Permission was given with the natural reluctance of men who know maps sometimes bring armies disguised as ideas. He unrolled a scroll of the district's veins and bones. Rivers, ridges, villages like small lanterns pinned where food becomes community. With a reed, he traced routes that had recently grown unsafe. With a pebble he named granaries that dreamed of rats. With a finger he indicated a string of hamlets that had learned to think of their wheat as a tax collector's biography. "My lord intends," he said, "to send troops to patrol these lines, not to harvest fear, but to restore it to those who deserve it." He paused for either indignation or praise. The room gave him neither, which is how rooms decline to be fooled. "Patrols," the magistrate murmured, "are best when they arrive like weather and leave like weather. Too much intention stains the sky." The envoy turned a cup in his hands, hearing a small council there. The steward's eyes weighed the cost of pride with the cost of peace, and began, almost visibly, to count. He stepped forward with a modesty that let the table grow larger. "A proposition," he said, and set the practice pole gently upon the mat, cloths folded like sleeping cranes. "Where these lines cross markets and shrines, let patrols be mixed, one color and the other, one ledger keeper chosen by both, monk or scribe to sit beneath a shared lantern. Where patrols are not needed, let them not be invented. Where they are, let them learn to greet roofs before banners." Historians will argue whether such arrangements prevent war or merely complexify it. The Day, practical as carrots, suggested that complex peace is better than elegant violence. The steward looked to the envoy to the magistrate to the monk, refusing the burdens of office, arranged 3 cups in a triangle. "Triangles," he said mildly, "are hard to topple, and they have enough edges to keep attention honest. Agreement, when it has decided to exist, does not always walk in with a drum. It arrived as a change in the shape of everyone's shoulders." The steward nodded once. "We will report this shape," he said. The envoy added, nearly under his breath, "and try to keep it." The magistrate wrote a sentence that would make future clerks grateful and future schemers impatient. The boy, who had watched maps pretend to be inevitable, looked relieved to see a reed and a pebble stop being weapons and become briefly Commissaire Geography. Before the afternoon could congratulate itself, the fortress reminded them what stone is for. A horn note from the western wall, the thin sort that does not panic so much as ask the day to explain itself, carried across the court. A monk approached with the quickness of someone who has walked news many times. "Travelers at the lower gate," he reported. "A caravan with wounds, some on animals, more on pride. They carry a story that does not fit in one throat." He and the boy went with the envoy and the steward, and, after a heartbeat, the magistrate, because good ledgers prefer to see their ink shaken once before it dries. The lower gate opened to a patch of road that remembered yesterday's sandstorm. The caravan's wagons had chewed those memories into a muddle. Men and women with dust to their knees carried bundles bound with sincere knots. A child clutched a pot too big for soup but perfect for feeling useful. A trader showed a cut on his forearm where an argument with a spear had failed to remain theoretical. Their tale came out in braided voices. A patrol not of either color had stopped them in the name of emergency requisition, taken cloth and salt and 2 mules with documents that looked persuasive until read by eyes who wanted more than the comfort of seals. The crest had been unfamiliar. The tone had been practiced. The route labeled "forbidden for now" happened, unfortunately, to be the only safe route left after the rains. "Bandits who read," the boy said low, and the trader, hearing, laughed in that tired way that admits a miserable truth. At such moments, decisions attempt to clothe themselves in law as quickly as decency allows. The steward's jaw clenched. The envoy's brow found a new furrow. The magistrate's brush tapped his sleeve where ink lived. He asked to see the documents. The traveler produced paper that, like a polite liar, almost bowed. The seal was clever but counterfeit in a way that insulted anyone who had ever loved a flower. the peony's smallest notch missing again, as if a particular deceit had found a comfortable shoe and kept wearing it. They have learned repetition, the envoy said. Repetition is a cousin of confidence. He considered, and then did a thing that had been waiting behind his lacquer for perhaps longer than he knew. He removed the small signet he wore on a cord and placed it upon the traveler's palm. If you meet them again, he said, ask them to press this beside their paper and explain the mismatch. If their courtesy survives, escort them here. If not, bring only their names. He looked at the boy and added, as if to instruct himself, we do not give weapons to strangers lightly, but sometimes a seal is only a mirror. Let them see. They settled the caravan within the outer yard, where monks had a genius for placing bowls in hands at speeds that embarrassed hunger. While Gratitude took a seat and put its shoes under the table, the magistrate wrote 2 writs, one to the council's patrol captains along the western routes, the other to the minor lords commanders who still valued sleep. The steward agreed to carry both because carrying both, like triangles, is hard to topple. The envoy stood at the garden's edge as if listening for a word that would make vanity say, please. He turned to the warrior. How many days can patience continue to be new? As many as humility can continue to be surprised, he said. And when humility stops being surprised? Then it must be taught, he answered, the way bridges teach, with weight shared and nothing to polish but wood. Night arrived with a coolness that knew where to put itself. Mats were unrolled beneath a corridor whose beams smelled faintly of prayers and sap. The boy lay awake longer than ordinary, tracing in the mind the roads on the captain's map, the triangle of cups on the monk's mat, the shape a caravan makes when it breathes again. Sensei, he whispered, what if the ones with false seals learn to like our triangles and put their point where it hurts? The older man watched the square of sky framed by the roof and thought of a pine that had once caught an oath midair and kept it. Then we stand under the point, he said, until it learns it is just a corner. Somewhere beyond the dark's gentle arguments, banners turned in their sleep. Perhaps they dreamed for once of benches arranged in squares that wished to be circles, and of a practice pole leaned against a wall, waiting for the next wind to decide which lesson it wished to teach. Dawn sifted itself through the cloister beams, a pale flower of light that made the garden stones seem freshly kneaded, and he woke to the small, companionable noises a place makes when it remembers how to be lived in. Ladles touching bowls, sandals negotiating the idea of purpose, a monk coughing like a polite bell. The boy stirred, rubbed sleep from his eyes with the economy of someone who has learned that every gesture can be a sentence, and together they stepped into air that tasted faintly of cedar smoke and tea. The fortress, which had spent yesterday deciding whether to be monastery or garrison, wore both with less embarrassment this morning. Banners were still banners, but they had learned not to preen, and the garden's cabbages had accepted their rank without sarcasm. He carried the practice pole because habit is a road even on days when there are newer roads to try, and when they crossed the outer yard they found the envoy already awake. Lacquer softened by use, speaking quietly with the steward and the magistrate, whose ledger closed with a sound like a kind letter folded well. The caravan slept under borrowed awnings, mules dreaming of simpler arithmetic, and the captain with the clean jaw studied a map that had learned humility overnight and now waited to be asked rather than to be believed. They did not rush toward plans as boys rush toward water. They let the morning finish its sentence. Then the magistrate proposed the first small thing, which is how large things are taught to behave. Mixed patrols would leave along 3 arterials, triangles of witness stitched from monk, scribe, and soldier. No levy to be touched unless the council's seal agreed with the envoy's signet like 2 notes tuned to 1 string. The The steward nodded with the grave obedience of a man who has outlived several tidy theories. The envoy signed the writs without show, and the monk sanded the ink, and it was decided that the boy would walk with the Western Patrol for a stretch, not as hostage or ornament, but as the sort of witness whose eyes were too young to be lazy. They set out when wind remembered to move. The western road sloped through barley that had not yet committed to gold. Jackdaws argued politely over a fence post. Somewhere, a wheel found a stone and chose humor instead of complaint. The patrol, awkward at first, colors mistrusting each other's stitching, learned a rhythm from the monk's beads and the boy's unthreatening attention. He walked ahead with the captain long enough to measure what kind of pride lived in that spine. Not brittle, not theatrical, more the pride of a plank that does not wish to split under weather it cannot name. "Your triangles," the captain said at last, not unkindly, "are difficult to march."
"Good," the older man replied. "Geometries that carry weapons easily tend to forget the weight of water." They passed a hamlet where smoke rose as if it had been taught etiquette. The head woman set out pickles with the sovereignty of someone whose doorway had outlasted 3 tax collectors and 1 winter that wanted applause. She examined the mixed patrol without flattering it. "If you two fight while wearing my dust," she said, "I will have you sweep it." The captain bowed. The monk smiled into his sleeve. The boy tried not to grin and failed. Word of bandits who read had flown ahead on sparrow wings. At the first ferry, a boatman showed them a strip of paper pressed with the wrong peony, the notch missing like a tooth one keeps forgetting with the tongue. They came at dusk, he said, and their politeness felt borrowed. The envoy's signet on its cord answered the forgery with a cool, small truth. The boatman, reassured by metal that did not boast, agreed to carry travelers for free until the next moon as a lesson offered to the river. Such arithmetic, he thought, was the sort that keeps bridges from falling even when carpenters are tired. At the second milestone, a shrine fox wore a new bib stitched from a merchant's torn sash. Payment made into piety by hands that wanted the story more than the coin. And at the third milestone, they found the first of the requisitioners' camps. Clever canvas, clean cooking stones, a ledge swept of footprints as if guilt had been taught housekeeping. The captain signaled. The patrol fanned not like a knife, but like water finding the low places. The boy kept his breath where his feet could use it. There were papers, of course. Never underestimate the zeal of a thief for stationery, and ledgers with numbers written in the careful manner of a man who believes form confers virtue. The monk sifted ashes from a brazier and found, beneath the gray, a bead of green wax with a private flaw the envoy later recognized as his steward's seal copied from memory and pride. "They have seen our tables," the captain said, voice even. "They have eaten at them," the older man answered, "and mistaken recipes for permission. They did not turn the camp into a theater of justice. They turned it into a lesson. Tents were taken down with the courtesy stolen things are owed before they are returned. The pot was left clean because hunger is innocent. The papers were bundled for the magistrate as a baker bundles yesterday's loaves that still might feed a story." On the road again, the boy asked the question that had been walking beside him. Why do men who know better choose the crooked seal instead of the straight path that already exists? He considered the barley, which continued to be barley without complaint. "Because the crooked path promises to be shorter," he said, "and because pride likes to arrive before responsibility has put on its sandals." By afternoon, clouds stacked thoughts along the ridges. Shadows lengthened like careful warnings. They reached a toll bridge where a trio of young swordsmen, fresh lacquer, bright teeth, and eagerness that outpaced the day, had installed themselves as guardians of orderly crossing. Their sign read like a proclamation written by a mirror. The captain inhaled in a way that wanted to become a speech.
The boy saw the breath before the decision and, remembering the teacher's brush, stepped forward with his empty palm and an apology prepared for use if needed. "We bring a triangle of witness," he said, as if he were offering a basket of persimmons. "Would you let it taste your rule?" The youngest, too swift to be cruel yet, scoffed. The eldest, old enough to remember a few mistakes and call them cousins, tilted his head. The monk produced the envoy's signet and the magistrate's writ. The captain produced nothing but his posture, which had learned to mean, "I am ready to carry what this moment cannot." There was arguing, certainly. Youth and law are cousins who never agree on supper, but it was an argument that preferred verbs like show and count to verbs like strike and bleed. In the end, the trio accepted the writ with the relief of men spared the embarrassment of having to defend a rule that would not last winter, and one of them, flushing, offered to sweep the toll house before they left. "Sweep twice," the boy suggested, failing at solemnity again. They turned back toward the fortress as the day began sowing evening to hedge and stone. On the last ridge, a shepherd whistled a tune that had lived longer than several regimes. Sheep, uninterested in jurisprudence, followed the rule that grass proposes. When the walls appeared, monastery wearing armor, armor remembering prayer, the courtyard had already arranged itself for news. Benches like commas, a table for facts, a quiet corner for the tired. The steward received the bundle of papers. The magistrate compared seals with a tenderness that proved love can be stern. The envoy listened without twitching, a discipline he had not yet mastered yesterday. "We will write to both lords," the magistrate said at last, naming the fault that repetition has taught. "We will send a copy to the Guild of Carvers, who despise bad flowers more than any court does." The envoy allowed himself the smallest smile at that, because craftsmen are the only censors pride remembers to fear. The captain reported on the bridge, omitting praise of himself like a decent man changing the subject. The monk refilled cups, and somewhere a bell marked 7th hour with the modest courage of metal that refuses to be melodrama. Later, in the long shade of a corridor that smelled of rain even when it had not rained, he and the boy sat with a woman whose hands carried the memory of temple bells, but whose sleeves were stained by ink. The fortress archivist, caretaker of scrolls that had watched empires learn and forget the same lesson repeatedly without boredom. She unrolled a thin history of the valley, lines like water on stone. It told of times when roads were patrolled by men who had memorized the cries of owls rather than the weight of coin, and of other times when seals multiplied like mushrooms after a storm, and the poorest learned to step where paper could not follow. "We always return," she said softly.
Not to the same place, perhaps, but to the same questions. The boy touched the practice pole and, as if the wood could answer, asked whether vows were not tiring when so many rooms eyed them with the practiced suspicion of furniture. "Vows are broom work," the archivist said. "They are tiring, and tomorrow there is more dust. But the room remembers." He thought of the fox-bibs and the swept toll house and the boatman's free ferry, and knew she was correct in a way that did not require triumph. Night took its place like a considerate guest. In the outer yard, caravan children learned a new game that involved shouting, "Notch!" and refusing to accept any peony without its tiny flaw. Laughter made a perimeter against gloom more competent than most walls. The envoy came briefly to where the practice pole leaned and touched the joined cloths as if asking their permission to be tired. "Your patience," he said, "has made me reconsider my pace." "Pace," the older man answered, "is merely the shape of your breath when it knows it will need to last." The envoy nodded and left a word behind him that might become friendship if not overwatered. The boy slept early, dreamless as a stone doing its job in a path. He sat longer, watching a moth insist upon a lantern,
and wondered whether tomorrow's road would carry letters or hooves, whether the false sealers would grow ashamed of their flower, whether the bridge trio would sweep even when no one watched. Beyond the hills, banners turned in their sleep, perhaps annoyed by the obstinacy of small mercies. And under the eaves, two cloths remembered wind and barely stirred, as if saving their breath for a morning that had not yet told anyone what name it wished to wear. The night folded itself carefully over the fortress like a monk putting away robes. No haste, no sound wasted, and the corridors took on that woven stillness in which footsteps think twice before becoming audible. He sat with the boy beneath the eaves where a lantern made a patient lake of light, rereading the letters that had traveled so far in his sleeve. The paper had learned the map of his pulse, the mother's harvest wish, the scholar's plea to cut rumor at the root, the Lord's brush, surprisingly honest about its doubts. The garden breathed cabbage and wet earth. A bell, somewhere, remembered a shorter century and refused to ring beyond its duty. Perhaps the day could have ended here, gently, with the envoy sleeping a little better and the steward discovering that humility did not poison tea. But it is a habit of certain evenings to test whether patience is truly sharp enough to be steel. He saw it first in the way the wind failed to snuff the lantern at a corner where it always triumphed. Too steady by a fraction, as if the night had decided to hold its breath. Then the boy touched his sleeve, not alarmed, only attentive, and tilted his chin toward the passage that led to the inner court. A monk walked there with the admirable clumsiness of someone trying not to look like a monk who was walking with purpose. His robe was clean, his stride correct, his face more interested in the floor than is beautiful for health, and yet his sandals told a different grammar. The strap wear favored the outside edge. Soldier's gait, not cleric's. The heel marks carried the small impatience of men who listen for orders with their shoulders. The boy's hand drifted, as if remembering a brushstroke, to the practice pole leaned against the column. The two cloths barely breathed. They followed with the courtesy of shadows, giving the stranger the dignity of not being pounced upon by certainty before certainty had earned the right. The monk paused at a door that had once opened to chance and now opened to the envoy's writing table. A moment's hesitation, too brief for an honest man to read, long enough for intention to grow a thin blade. He slid the door and faced an empty room, for the envoy had chosen to sleep in the outer yard near the caravans, as if borrowing their humble courage could amend his lacquer. The stranger crossed to the table and laid a palm on the papers there as if asking them to be quiet. Then he drew from his sleeve a roll sealed with a device as false as a smile, peony almost correct, notch missing like a story that refuses to confess its secret. He did not attempt the envoy's signet, he attempted speed. The scroll named a levy for the security of womankind, a title clever enough to shame objections and vague enough to harvest silver like rain harvests dust. He placed it among the writs, arranged the brushes so that guilt could pretend to be tidiness, and turned to go. The boy stepped into the doorway first, small enough to be mistaken for a question. The man stilled. The warrior entered not as a trap, but as a bowl, space offered, not snapped shut. "Brother," he said, giving the robe its hope, "the night is patient. Let us borrow its manners." The face that turned toward them performed humility without having rehearsed long enough to make it believable. Up close, the disguise failed where disguises usually fail, in the eyes, which had learned too much about windows and too little about prayer, in the hands, which had told truth to rope and had never once lifted incense without thinking of smoke as a signal. He did not draw. He asked the simplest questions: name, temple, the lineage of the bell whose tone had placed the stranger's breath, and the answers came smooth, except where they tripped on unimportant details a liar cannot be bothered to love. The man realized, as careful liars realize, that the room had no appetite for his performance. He considered force and found it too loud for the corridor. He tried charm and discovered it had gone to sleep early. His fingers twitched in the old language that weapons speak to wrists. Then they stopped, as if remembering a childhood that deserved not to be bruised by this decision. "It is only a paper," he said at last, choosing the most dangerous noun in governance. "A helpful lie that will keep streets quiet." The boy looked at the practice pole, at the two cloths sharing one wind, and answered in a voice that kept the floorboards calm. "Helpful lies cut the wrong throats first." The warrior moved closer by the distance of a breath. "Whose hand asked your hand to place it?" The stranger hesitated, which is to say, his honesty became visible for a heartbeat. Someone beyond the ridges with a talent for imitating seals and a hatred for mixed patrols. A patron tired of triangles and monks and ledger keepers with square backs. "You could have carried it openly," the warrior murmured, "but then it would have been read with daylight. Darkness writes quickly, daylight edits better." Perhaps it might have ended with the man lowering his gaze and his plan together. The corridor, however, had other students. Footsteps, two, no more, arrived with the brisk assurance of men who believe duty is a hat they alone know how to wear. The captain with the clean jaw appeared at the far end, and with him the steward, whose loyalty had not slept. They saw the robe, the scroll, the lantern's too steady flame. The captain's hand found the threshold of his hilt, as a cautious guest finds the threshold of a stranger's house. The steward's gaze fell to the false seal and burned with the humiliation of a craftsman forced to praise a counterfeit. Pride wanted a punishment that could be tallied. The warrior spoke before pride could spend the room's inheritance. "We are caught between two errors," he said, "mistaking mercy for weakness or mistaking fear for order. If we punish loudly, the scroll's ink becomes famous. If we do nothing, it will breed all night." The steward swallowed the heat of a better story. The captain released his breath as one releases a hawk that chooses for once to sit. They walked the man, not bound, only bracketed by regard, to the archivist's room, where scrolls slept like well-behaved snakes, and the air smelled of dust that had earned its residence. The woman with bell hands looked up and read the scene faster than a clerk reads a tally. The false writ lay on her table. She opened it with the distaste of someone asked to swallow a candle. "This," she said, "has been carved by a patient fool." She took out an older scroll, the fortress charter from before banners learned to preen here, and laid them side by side. The peony's honest notch sat like a small truth that refuses to become fashionable. "We will rewrite," she said, "not the lie, but the place where lies like to sit." And so they did the quiet work that saves mornings, a new practice set of forms whose margins left no room for glib emergencies, a ledger of seals with their tiny, embarrassing perfections, a guidance, stern but untheatrical, that any levy for virtue must be approved by mouths not owned by the levy, signed by hands that carry buckets and by hands that carry brushes, and spoken aloud under open sky. The steward copied each sentence as if it were a plank he might one day stand upon with his grandchildren watching. The captain signed with the careful weight of a shoulder that has learned bridges and their appetite for honesty. The monk sanded the ink. The boy blew once, as though giving the letters a good wind in which to dry. What of the man in monk's robes? He stood smaller now, not shrunken, only truer. The way a boast shrinks when it takes off its lacquer. He admitted, not proudly, the patron's name, which the steward and captain had already suspected, and which the envoy, arriving silent as apology, did not pretend to be surprised by. "If I lock him," the steward said, speaking to the room rather than to righteousness, "his patron gains a martyr. If I kill him, a rumor. If I let him go, a habit." The warrior turned to the boy, who had learned not to answer quickly. "What weighs least on a roof?" the boy asked after a time. "Water that runs where it should." He suggested a penance without theater. The man would spend a season on the copy bench under the archivist's quiet eye, learning the touch and the tedium of making truth beautiful. Each week he would carry a bucket at the gate, not as spectacle, but as practice for hands that had learned to hide things. At the end of the season he would choose robe, soldier's stripe, or the simple shirt of a messenger who prefers roads to rooms, and his choice would be his letter of repentance. The steward studied the boy as if the road had just introduced him to a cousin he wished he'd met sooner. "Done," he said. Toward midnight, the fortress exhaled. The false writ lay cut into slips that would become scrap for children to practice characters on. The archivist smiled the way ink smiles when it realizes it will not be asked to lie today. The captain took first watch on the west wall and watched the kind of darkness that carries no malice, only stars. The envoy, pausing by the practice pole, touched the two cloths as one touches a cheek before leaving, and asked no favors of them. He and the boy returned to the eaves. The lantern's lake trembled once and then held. "Did we win?" the boy asked, borrowing a younger vocabulary on purpose. "We taught morning where to begin," he said.
That is enough for a night. Sleep came like good counsel, unexcited, reliable. Above them the beams kept their old prayers. Below, the flagstones remembered footsteps that had chosen not to be loud. And far beyond the patient walls, banners turned in their sleep, a little tangled in dreams that could not quite decide whether to be thunder or to be rain. While on a corridor table, a clean brush awaited the first light, ready to write the kind of sentence that lets a gate remember why it opens. Dawn wrote its first thin sentence along the eastern ridge, and the fortress answered with small, honest noises. The broom stitching the courtyard, a bucket negotiating the well's old riddle, sandals testing the grain of boards that had held more arguments than parades. He woke before the bell, not to sharpen steel, but to inspect the quiet. The envoy sleeping near the caravan's tarps, where humility breathes easier. The steward reading by the stingy light of a drunk candle, lips moving as if to teach the ink some manners. The archivist already at her bench, coaxing a crease to lie flat with a fingertip that knew the strength of gentleness. The boy, wrapped like a comma in his mat, opened his eyes the instant the air changed, as students do when their questions grow ears. They ate rice that remembered rain and plums that remembered salt, and they carried the practice pole because habit survives where theory tires. In the outer yard, a small assembly took shape without fanfare. The envoy with his lacquer resigned to usefulness. The steward, shoulders squared by sleep that had made peace with conscience. The captain of the guard, jaw less clean now that reality had scuffed it into better proportions. 3 monks who could count a field by listening to wind, and the magistrate with snowdrift eyebrows, whose brush traveled with him like a tame blackbird. The council's letter had named today the day for courtesies and clarities to be exchanged in the chapel room where the old sutra shelves were stout enough to carry new agreements. He felt in his sleeve the mother's harvest wish, the scholar's plea to cut rumor at the root, the Lord's surprising confession of doubt. It seemed right that all of them should be read aloud, in their different key signatures, so each could tune the others. But first the fortress had to pass its morning test. Could stone remember to make space for breath? The chapel had kept its pride by keeping its humility. Its floorboards knew the weight of bowed heads. Its alcove wore a scroll whose ink had faded into a color that can be read only by patience. They laid the practice pole against the back wall as a visitor who had earned the right to lean. The envoy opened with an apology that did not audition for poetry. The steward followed with an inventory of embarrassments, false peonies, requisition virtues, the thieving subtlety by which paperwork teaches hunger to dress as duty. The magistrate countered with facts that had learned to walk, triangles of witness, toll houses swept twice, a fox whose bib was replaced by contrition, not coin.
Then came the monk with his simple arithmetic. Cups poured, roofs repaired, children returned to games that require no seal. At last he unfolded the letters. The mother's lines were short and clear, like a path that refuses to lie about its destination. The scholar's hand wavered where rumor had wounded breath. His lord's brush, honest in places where most men varnish, asked for a road in which blade and ink could travel without divorcing. He read them as one might recite sutras for the living, slow so the day could catch each syllable as it passed. A silence gathered that did not ask to be filled.
There are moments when governance remembers it is merely the art of keeping promises alongside weather. The steward cleared his throat and proposed a binding. Mixed patrols at named crossings, levees frozen at last. Harvests measure unless famine, certified by monks and scribes together, asked the village for more. Seals catalogued under the archivist's jealous eye, and every writ that claimed virtue to be read aloud under open sky, so that embarrassment could do its small, excellent work. The envoy signed, not with a flourish, but with a breath. The magistrate signed as if laying a plank. The captain signed with the restraint of a man who intends to be useful even when no one thanks him.
The boy, not permitted to sign, held the pole upright so the two cloths could approve with a small tremor. The agreement did not strut. It sat down where work could find it. News, like water, dislikes empty hands. Before ink had fully dried, a runner arrived at the west gate, sandals speaking the grammar of urgency, not panic. A mill town one valley over had woken to an argument older than its wheel, a feud between two families whose stones bordered the river and whose memories bordered nothing. In years of quiet they had traded jokes, then recipes, then brides. In years of scarcity they traded accusations, and lately, due to one ambitious nephew with a gift for sarcasm, they had traded slaps. Now the wheel lay silent, the river sulking around it, and the baker's flour had turned to rumor faster than bread. The envoy looked to the steward to the magistrate to him. He nodded because nodding was all that was needed to move feet. He and the boy set out with the captain, a monk, and two ledger keepers whose pens had weathered more storms than most horses. The road dropped through alder shade into the town's small bowl. Here was the wheel, taller than a man's pride. Here the axle worn to the calm honesty of old bone. Here the two houses, facing each other across water as cousins face across a holiday they're pretending to enjoy.
Women had folded their arms into arguments. Men had found reasons to repair tools that did not need repairing. Children had invented a game where you shout, "Mine," and then must carry a bucket across a line without spilling, which is to say, they had discovered law.
He stepped onto the low stone by the sluice gate and made a bow that a village can accept without feeling smaller. "If we mend the wheel," he said, "will both houses call the bread fair?" The ambitious nephew laughed too quickly. He wore the self-assurance of a man who mistakes timing for wisdom. "Fair is a story told by a mouth with more flour," he said, and his uncle winced because he recognized his own past in that tone. The monk inspected the water like a physician listening to a chest. "Your gate leaks vanity," he murmured, "so your wheel spins sarcasm." The boy, who had learned the language of ropes and planks beneath a broken bridge, waded into the sluice and pressed his palm to a seam that had been waiting for a hand since autumn. "Here," he said softly, and the captain was already kneeling beside him, thumbs agreeing on the proper shape of pressure. They wedged a plank the width of a vow. They set two stones like commas where the stream needed to pause. The wheel tried a sentence, failed, tried again, found its subject. Slowly, Almost shyly, Grain returned to the day's grammar. But the wound lived not in wood. It lived, as usual, in anniversaries remembered too sharply. The two patriarchs stood opposite, eyes narrowed by long practice, and when the wheel obliged them by working, they found themselves without a respectable reason to continue. He invited both to the miller's threshold, which had learned to hear most human ideas and to forgive many of them. He asked for a ledger, not to weaponize it, but to let it sit open like a bowl between them. "List," he said, "what the other family gave you the year the big flood came." The old men blinked, because resentment edits memory and gratitude misplaces its spectacles. The niece, bright-eyed, flower on her cheek like a blessing that had not asked permission, ventured the first entry. "A ladder," she said, "and a rope that did not break." Next came coals when our hearth drowned, then the ox when ours coughed, and a shawl for a mother whose pride refused blankets if they were named charity. Little by little, the ledger learned to speak both ways. The nephew shifted. Sarcasm is a poor coat in rooms where gratitude warms the air. Still, habit insists on one last argument before it goes to bed. "And how," he said, forcing his courage into words that did not deserve it, "do we price the insult at New Year when they laughed at our cracked bell?" The boy, dry now, hair inclined to mischief by river wind, answered with a line the archivist had used the night before. "We sweep it," he said, "twice, if the floor remembers." Some laughter, honest and not unkind, loosened the day's jaw. He proposed a repair that felt sacred because it was ordinary. The wheel to turn first for the house that had a funeral this season, then for the house with a birth, then alternating as the river's patience allowed. The sluice gate to be tended by hands of both roofs at dawn, any mockery to be paid in bread. The monk added a sweeter clause, the cracked bell to be hung in the mill so that all jokes would ring in the place where flour becomes forgiveness. The ledger keepers wrote, thumbs staining the page with the clean grease of work, and both patriarchs at last found the courage to mutter the unheroic, indispensable word, agreed. A child who had been watching from a windowsill asked the question that should always be invited to counsel. Who rings the cracked bell first? He looked at the boy, and the boy looked at the river, and the river, being itself, refused to take sides. The one who can laugh at himself without needing witnesses, the boy said, and one of the patriarchs surprised everyone by stepping forward, picking up the frayed rope, and proving that such a person still existed. The sound the bell made was not beautiful. It was honest. People smiled the way roofs do when the first dry day follows a week of rain. Bread went into ovens with a purpose that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with supper. They stayed until twilight convinced the town it could manage without them. On the ridge back, barley colored itself toward evening. Swallows wrote footnotes around their ankles. The captain walked quieter than he had in the morning, as if the valley had explained something his sword had never bothered to ask. I thought today would require steel, he said. It required kneeling in cold water. Both are postures, he answered. Only one is overused. The boy carried the practice pole on his shoulder. The cloths, red and white, had collected a little flour, which they wore like proof of employment. When the fortress came into view, its stones looked less stern, perhaps because sternness, having been put to work, had tired into decency. In the outer yard, the envoy waited with 2 letters, one from the council acknowledging the day's agreement in language that had learned to be specific, the other from their lord, brief as a blade, requesting their presence at court within a fortnight to discuss the temperament of boarders. Temperament, he knew, was a polite word for appetite. He felt the pine of the first night lean, a whisper in sap and resin that oaths should move the way weather moves, arrive, work, and go. He smiled without display and nodded to the boy, to the pole, to the hall where ink had earned its right to dry. "We go," he said, and the word belonged now not to departure, but to continuity. Far in the dark, beyond the hills, banners turned in their sleep, perhaps a little less certain of thunder, a little more respectful of rain, and in the chapel where the practice pole rested, the two cloths sighed once, as if saving their strength for winds that would try, very soon, to blow harder than sense. The road to court began like any other, dust deciding whether to rise, sparrows hiding their bravado in hedges. But by the third day the miles wore a different grammar. Each milestone a comma that warned the sentence ahead would be spoken in a larger room. He and the boy walked in a pace that could survive listening. The practice pole rode the boy's shoulder, its two cloths folded tight as traveling courtesy. Villages slipped past with their ordinary courage, laundry behaving like flags of peace, wells remembering everyone's name, and then fields gave way to estates where gatekeepers bowed with the precision of abacuses. The capital announced itself first with paper, notices layered on gateboards like overlapping leaves, proclamations arguing in polite fonts, seals impressed so often the wood grain had learned to dream in peonies. The palace sat beyond a moat that preferred reflection to resistance, roofs tiered like measured breath, corridors long enough to teach footsteps patience. Banners slept along the eaves as if the day had agreed to stay mostly indoors. A steward led them through courtyards where raked gravel kept its opinions in straight lines. A fox statue watched from a niche, its stone bib clean and slightly amused. Outside the council hall, a cedar screen wore the history of other mornings, scuffs where urgency had failed to bow deeply enough, a faint smear of ink from a sleeve that had hugged a writ too close. He touched the place as one greets an old scar, then stepped inside and let his attention bow before his body did.
The chamber did not threaten, it tested. Floorboards that remembered victories and errors. A painting of distant pines that asked small questions about humility. A long table low enough to remind everyone that knees, too, are instruments of state. Their lord sat not high, only correctly, the daylight having chosen his sleeve as an honest place to rest. On one side, familiar faces, the envoy whose lacquer had learned restraint, the magistrate with snowdrift brows, the archivist, summoned from fortress shadows, carrying a scroll case like a lantern.
On the other, men whose crests had been pressed into them by many ancestors and a few recent ambitions. Among them a strategist whose fan looked as if it had been sharpened before it was painted. A map lay unrolled so wide it seemed to breathe, rivers like cool veins, borders drawn where mountains would tolerate them and swamps would not. Their lord inclined his head a fraction that meant welcome without promise. "We discuss temperament," he said, the brush-stroke voice from the letter now inhabiting a throat. "These borders have moods, so do men." The strategist opened with courtesy as rigid as lacquer, naming caravans intercepted by necessary requisitions. Patrols stretched thin as old sandals, minor lords who mistook improvisation for policy. His fan pointed at villages like a short sword, choosing where to bend. "We will harden the lines," he said. "A fence that smiles is still a fence." The envoy, made braver by recent humility, answered with the ledger of small mercies that had not made poems, but had kept roofs from learning new leaks, shared poles at village gates, toll houses that swept twice, a bridge that healed hands faster than pride could bruise them. The magistrate spoke of triangles of witness. The archivist unfurled narrow scrolls, annotated with peony notches, and the names of carvers who refused to cut dishonest flowers. He listened, and when they had said enough for the room to be full, He placed the practice pole upon the map's edge, the cloths asleep until wind or need should wake them. "Majesty," he murmured, "fences can be sharpened or hinged. Where they hinge, doors learn to remember both sides."
He did not lecture. He told the story of the mill wheel and a cracked bell that made men honest by refusing to be beautiful. He described a toll house that remained a bowl because hands recalled what bowls are for, a bridge mended when swords chose to lift lumber, a counterfeit peony that led to a guild's anger more useful than a court's. He did not omit his failures or the moments when luck had mistaken itself for wisdom. The strategist's fan stilled just enough to resemble listening. "You make weather into law," the man said at last. "Storms arrive regardless." "Yes," he answered, "but rafters are built in clear weather. We cannot hammer during thunder and call that foresight." A minister with a voice like cold water asked the question that sometimes arrives disguised as doubt and sometimes as help. "What prevents our patience from being misread at distant gates as invitation?" He nodded to the boy. "He does," he said simply, and the room blinked at the impertinence until it realized he meant witness. Young eyes in mixed patrols, ledgers read aloud under sky, vows hung where markets breathe, captains who know the difference between standing and looming. "We sharpen patience daily," he added. "It leaves a smaller scar." Their lord requested the letters he still carried, the mother's wish for a harvest anonymous with peace, the scholar's plea to cut rumor at the root, the earlier confession in their lord's own brush about doubt's dignity. He read the first two aloud and placed the third before the man who had written it, as a soldier returns a blade that has remembered itself. Silence drew up a stool and sat close. Then the Lord surprised his courtiers by asking for the archivist's case. She opened it to reveal a narrow, stubbornly plain volume, a register of seals with their tiny flaws, and beneath it a shorter scroll of customs nearly lost, two banners on one pole during dispute, guards from rival colors sharing a bowl beneath the gate, levies frozen at last harvest unless monks and scribes agree to pronounce the word famine together. Custom, the Lord said, is a quiet constitution. The strategist's fan clicked once, a hinge conceding. It is also slow. The boy, who rarely spoke in such halls, asked permission with a glance. Receiving it, he said, "Slowness keeps the rice from scorching." Laughter, a modest humankind, found the edges of the table and chose to sit. Enough consent gathered to matter. Edicts were drafted, not with drums but with punctuation. Mixed patrols by rule, not mood. Requisition forbidden without twin seals pressed before witnesses. Counterfeit flowers, a crime to be punished by work at the guild, until humility learns a carver's wrist. All papers that claim virtue to be read aloud where roofs can listen. The strategist added one clause like a pebble properly placed. Border beacons to signal counsels, not charges. Light for law, not flame for fear. He inclined his fan slightly toward the boy, a gesture as close to apology as his profession allows. The Lord sealed the scrolls with a sun that did not pretend to be summer and looked to him for the last word. He declined the honor with a bow that let the room grow large again. "Let the first word be wood," he said. "Send a carpenter to each gate with a pole and two cloths. Teach wind to be impartial. Courtrooms conclude. Life does not." In the corridor after, where sandals remember more than officials do, a messenger found them with a thin envelope scented by travel and a certain grief. News from the coastal road of a storm that had unseamed 3 granaries and a rumor that had tried to finish the work. The envoy stopped walking. The strategist's fan forgot to be a blade. Their lord handed him the writ with a look that was neither command nor plea, but kin to both. "Go," it said, without speaking the word. He and the boy bowed and turned their steps toward the scent of salt.
At the gate, a fox watched them again. He set the practice pole against the post to tighten the knots, and a palace guard, young, too proud of his silence, asked if the two small cloths truly mattered beyond their symbolism. The boy answered before he could, voice soft as brush on paper. They give the wind a job. The guard considered that as if it might one day save his life. They left the capital by a road that had learned to carry both orders and doubt. Afternoon thinned into a color the sea likes to borrow. Reeds rehearsed a wind they had not yet met. He walked with the weight of new edicts folded in his sleeve and old vows folded in his bones, wondering, as men do who prefer gates to walls, whether paper could arrive in time to remind fear to be specific. The boy adjusted the pole on his shoulder. The cloths breathed, small and steady. Behind them, the Lord's Hall began the work of turning sentences into habits. Ahead, the coast would be teaching men how quickly hunger tries to change its name.
On a ridge between them, a pine stood and kept its resinous counsel. He paused there long enough to let the sky witness what the ground would be asked to keep, to move like weather, arrive, work, and go, keeping the blade a mirror rather than a tongue. And far off, where land traded manners with tide, banners of cloud were already rolling, listening for footfalls that preferred hinges to spikes. While somewhere in a wet, uneasy granary, a single lantern waited to see whether the first hand through the door would carry ink or iron. The coastal road unspooled toward them with a smell like wet rope and old promises, gulls punctuating the sky with small, insistent commas, and by the time they reached the headland, the storm's handwriting still showed on everything. Roofs combed backwards, fences told to reconsider their vocation. A cart turned on its side as if repentance could be achieved by posture alone. At the first granary, a lantern flickered in the afternoon, as if embarrassed to still be on duty. The door hung from one hinge, not broken so much as undecided.
He and the boy stepped into a room that remembered the sea in the dampest ways. Sacks collapsed into sullen hills, salt drying on boards like tired lace, a broom with its bristles spread in a gesture of tragic optimism. Two old men counted what could still be counted. A woman with sleeves rolled high wrote in chalk on a plank because paper had too much memory for days like this. Rumor came before we could stand the sacks, she said without preface, voice steady as a bucket that refuses to slop. Faces we knew and faces we didn't, saying others had already taken their share at the next village, so we might as well hurry. They brought a peony stamp that almost fooled the board. She showed it, the same missing notch, the same smug curve that pretended to be mercy. He nodded toward the practice pole and the boy planted it by the doorway, cloth still, as if the wind itself were waiting for permission. We will read the room aloud, he said, and asked the chalk for names, the sacks for numbers, the floor for the shape of recent feet. The boy knelt and touched the drag marks, reading a story that had all the urgency of greed and none of its talent. Someone had hauled sacks toward the shore and then lost interest or courage where the alley narrowed, and the tide had not helped. It had only watched, as tides do, and whispered neutrality into every crack.
They moved on to the second granary, where storm had been less philosophical. Here, a wall had opened its conscience. Boards splayed like ribs, rice kissing daylight it had never meant to meet. A captain of mixed patrol stood there already, a woman with hair plaited so tightly even rumors could not loosen it, keeping a knot of villagers and strangers from inventing a new arithmetic on the spot. He bowed to her authority, and she to his patience, and together they did not argue. They placed planks instead, and the boy found a way to turn the sail from a beached skiff into a temporary skin for the wounded wall.
A fisherman with a face like cured leather lent rope with the air of a man who knows debts and hates them. and by the time the tide decided to be sociable, the wall could hold a conversation again. "The missing?" the captain asked. "3 carts," the fisherman said, "taken inland along the Pepper Road, men polite like embroidery, and a monk who smiled too much." He smiled without amusement. Monks who smiled too much had lately become a weather system. They followed the Pepper Road, modest in its ambition but thorough in its gossip, and met the carts at a shrine where the fox had stayed put in the storm, stone bib salt-streaked and proud. The men standing there were local enough to know which reeds cut soft and which cut true. Their politeness wore fatigue like a borrowed coat. The monk, if monk he was, had the difficult ease of someone afloat on the idea of virtue. "We requisition for safety," he announced, showing a writ that bowed in all the usual places and lied perfectly in the small one. The boy held out the envoy's signet with a gentleness that was not a trap. "Press," he invited. The seal confessed by refusing to agree with itself. Its face blushed toward counterfeit. The men looked at one another with that specific disappointment crews share when their captain's map forgets about cliffs. The monk's smile thinned into the string of a bow that had never learned a song. "The court moves slowly," he said. "Hunger drips faster." The captain answered him with the inventory made at the first granary, with the tally chalked by a woman who had refused to let panic hold the chalk, with the debt the fisherman had paid in rope, with the wall that had learned to be skin. "Slowness," she said, "is not a wound if hands work while we wait." She named the triangles of witness and the rule of 2 seals, red under sky. She pointed to the practice pole where the cloths had decided a breeze could be trusted again. "We will escort the carts back as guests," he added, "so they arrive in dignity rather than in triumph." The monk considered how much theater remained available to him. Not enough. He lowered his gaze and found within that gesture the uncommon comfort of not needing to pretend to be exceptional. "I was sent to prove that patience fails," he said in a voice that no longer hunted, "and instead I learned what buckets do." He asked permission to carry a ladle when they returned. The captain granted it, not as punishment but as education written into wrists. Repair is seldom linear. News from the 3rd granary arrived at a run, but the runner had already spent his breath on the hill and could only hand gestures to his hands. A stranger with a banner, small but loud, had climbed the storehouse steps and begun reading a levy from a scroll that highlighted its own virtue with ink the color of vanity. He and the boy cut across yards where fish lay on bamboo like punctuation marks waiting for grammar. At the square, a knot of listeners had formed, their expressions the careful blank of people measuring a stranger before letting him borrow their worry. The stranger wore a crest that had been fashionable 2 regimes ago and spoke in that generous cadence tyrants adopt when they think kindness, once purchased, will become a habit. He proclaimed emergency redistribution in a voice that begged for an audience. He denounced hoarders in a tone that enjoyed itself. He cited the absentee softness of councils. The scroll's peony notch, of course, was wrong. The boy did not sigh. He placed the envoy's signet and the council's edict upon a stool, and the captain lifted both so that roofs could see as well as ears could hear. He stepped forward with the practice pole and set it between the reader and the sacks. The red and white cloth stirred, and the wind, pleased to be given a task again, remembered impartiality. "Read with me," he said without thunder. "Here is the law that binds my patience and your hunger to the same plank." He recited the clause about twin seals, the one about famine spoken twice by monk and scribe, the one about open sky and embarrassment. He did not accuse, he accounted. The stranger performed annoyance with professional skill. Then he saw the tide of faces had already turned, not against him exactly, but toward a different kind of belonging. A miller's widow raised her hand like a schoolgirl. "You may help carry," she said, "or you may sit." Your choice decides which story the village keeps. The man glanced at his banner, small as a temper. He folded it slowly. When a child clapped, the square laughed, not unkindly, only with the relief laughter becomes when danger suddenly turns out to be ordinary.
All afternoon they audited, not the kind that bites, the kind that rinses, moving sacks, weighing intentions, reading boots, airing damp. They posted the inventory where the wind could memorize it. They placed the cracked bell from the river town on the storehouse beam and let it be rung once by each person who had considered taking without asking. The sound was not beautiful, and that was the point. Truth had no need of incense on a day like this. Toward evening, the real monks from the headland temple arrived, robes like clouds that have learned decency, and set about boiling porridge with the unemotional love of professionals.
One of them recognized the false smiling monk from the pepper road and placed in his hands a ladle with a grip polished by decades of instruction. The man received it as one receives a sword when one has decided not to use it. "Will this hold?" the captain asked, meaning the wall, the vow, the village. "Until it doesn't," he said, "because kindness is not a forecast, only a practice." "And if it doesn't?" "We will come back," the boy answered for him, and the captain's smile had the proud humility of someone discovering that her best reinforcements were already standing inside the gate. They walked the berm at dusk, the sea shoulder to shoulder with them, breathing its long, instructive breath. He felt the weight of new edicts in his sleeve lighter than he had feared, heavier than he had hoped. He felt the old vow in his bones choose again to be weather. Below, the granary lamps settled into honest constellations. Above, cloud banners rolled without orders. "Sensei," the boy said quietly, "what do we do when the next man arrives with a perfect peony?" He thought of the archivist's ledger of notches, the guild's stubborn wrists, the bridge where excellence had learned to lift, the wheel that had chosen to turn for funerals before births. "We remember that flowers are not seals," he said. "People are, and people keep their shape by the work they repeat." The knight agreed in the language of crickets. They turned toward the inland path because roads preferred to be checked rather than trusted, and as they left the headland, a small wind traveled down the practice pole, red and white learning again, as if for the first time, how to share the same air. While somewhere beyond the dunes, drums tested their skins without deciding what to say, and farther still, beyond hills that had learned to hinge instead of sharpen, banners turned in their sleep, uneasy with those quiet victories that refuse to be counted and yet keep the rice from souring. The inland path folded away from the salt like a letter finally answered, and the air changed. Less iron, more leaf, so that even the boys' shoulders let go of a grit they hadn't noticed carrying. They walked where reeds gave up their gossip to alders, where dragonflies traded the sea's punctuation for the small footnotes of ponds, and where fields, still damp with the storm's leftover breath, tried on their old shapes the way a village tries on calm after a loud visitor leaves. He carried the new edicts in his sleeve and the old vow in his bones, and he felt them speak to one another as papers, and promises sometimes do when they have decided to be kin. Keep the gate hinged, keep the bowl empty for the right hunger, keep the wind impartial. Toward noon, above a wide meander of river, they met a procession that was more caution than ceremony. 3 carts, a net of children walking like scattered fish beside them, and a woman at the front whose staff had polished a groove in her palm over many winters. Her sash was temple gray, her eyes were not. She bowed to the practice pole and smiled at the cloths as if greeting modest heroes. "We go upstream," she said, "to a village that has forgotten how to stay fed. Not by drought, by story. Someone has taught them that grain kept aside for lean months is a kind of cowardice. They empty their jars to look brave and wake afraid." The boy's mouth made a small protest. No wind heard. He had seen Rice behave like patience, not theater. "Who carves courage into waste?" he asked. "A name travels," the woman replied, lowering her voice against the trees. "A patron with borrowed monks and a taste for crowds. He reads, and the crowd feels itself larger when its jars feel lighter." The tale had the shape of a road that had been walked before, false peonies, borrowed virtue. Yet this mask grinned differently, as if daring them to argue with a phrase everyone wanted to like. They turned with the procession, because sometimes the shortest distance between a lie and its correction is the length of a song. Upstream, the village straddled the river like a patient rider. On one bank, granary jars waited with their mouths open to the day. On the other, a square had dressed itself for a performance it did not entirely trust. Banners without crests, an improvised dais, a cracked bell from some ancestor's shed hung where its unhandsome honesty could be consulted. He and the boy arrived as the reader mounted the boards, not a monk this time, but a man in plain robe with a scholar's sleeves and a merchant's appetite for verbs that get things done. He did not shout. He spoke with the coaxing tone of a host arranging chairs. "Fear," he said, "has built more walls than any enemy. Let us be new. Let us be generous now while our courage is fresh." He lifted a ladle as a banner. People, grateful to be invited to admire themselves, lined up to pour. Jars sighed. The cracked bell watched, unimpressed. He did not stride into the square. He touched the practice pole to the dais steps the way one touches a friend's shoulder before suggesting a different road. The cloth stirred. The wind found its job. "Hospitality is a harvest," he said, his voice not scolding, only remembering. "It is also an arithmetic. If we empty our jars at noon for a story that promises a new moon by supper, what do we ask children to eat when the moon keeps its appointments with the sky instead?" The reader smiled the smile of a man who believes he can teach even caution to be fashionable. "Tomorrow will honor today," he said. "Every generous village becomes a story. Stories earn help." The boy's breath found the place his teacher had shown him, the small meadow before the decision, and he stepped forward, hands open, face without accusation. "Stories earn help," he agreed softly, "but help that arrives because it heard hunger bang. The pot is different from help that arrives, because it heard pride ring the bell." There was a murmur, not the kind that feeds riot, the kind kitchens make when they decide to add one more bowl to the table. The woman with the temple sash lifted her staff, not to command, only to give the square something firm to look at. "Read with us," she asked the scholar merchant. "The rules our elders wrote when famine and flood were more familiar than banners are lately." A boy fetched the rolled scroll from the granary's sill where steam had once curled its edges. She unknotted it with fingers that had taught other knots to be less proud. There it was, in ink that had lost all taste for theater, last harvest's measure to be honored before gifts, shared jars kept sealed by 2 hands, grain for ceremonies counted separately from grain for breath. "We have grown modern," the reader said gently, and the word modern tried to dust itself with bravery. "Then let us count like people who wish to see the next spring," the woman replied, and her staff rang once on the dais in a rhythm older than edicts. The crowd shifted again, the way a room shifts when it is almost willing to remember housekeeping. The reader, clever, courteous, dangerous, gestured to the jar of a widow whose grief had settled into competence. "Will we deny this mother the chance to be admired?" he asked. The widow lifted the ladle, looked at its bright curve, and then looked at the cracked bell. "I will be admired when the roof holds in winter," she said, and set the ladle down as if returning a borrowed character to a sentence. Laughter, the useful kind, hummed under the eaves. The boy caught the reader's eye not to trap him, but to hand him a door. "If you wish to write courage here," he said,
Write it in ledgers and roofs. Help us build the jar that is meant for guests, and help us keep the others sealed so our children can be rude enough to grow." The reader's smile faltered, found its manners, then looked for the nearest wind, and discovered the wind had been hired for other work. "Who sent you?" the older man asked, as if asking whether to declare allegiance. The reader's glance strayed upstream, where a hill wore a shaved crown like a monk's, and where a small pavilion watched the river with the peculiar patience of money waiting for applause. He admitted a patron, a name that had fluttered through fortresses and toll houses with the same clever absence as a thief who never entered a room without leaving a glove to be found. "He believes," the reader said, "that your triangles and your bowls will not survive a hungry winter. He believes stories travel faster than policy."
The boy, who had seen a bridge taught by hands and a wheel taught by cold water, answered with a quiet the reed listened to. "Stories travel," he said, "houses keep." The woman with the staff turned to the square. "Let us do both," she suggested. "Put aside the jars sealed by 2 hands, then count a bowl we can share in the name of the storm. Let the reader carry that bowl along the road and tell what he saw. Work, not applause. If his patron loves stories, give him this one."
They counted, they sealed, they tied. He and the boy watched shoulders lower by honest inches. The scholar merchant took the travel bowl and, to his credit, did not try to make it a crown. He held it like a duty that might improve him if it were heavy enough. "What if the patron arrives?" a girl asked from the granary steps, where she'd been defending a jar with a broom whose bristles splayed like honest hair. "Then we will pour him water first," the woman said, "and ask him to help lift roofs until he prefers lumber to speeches." The cracked bell, invited, offered an opinion that made nobody heroic, but made everyone cheerful. At dusk, the pavilion's path finally admitted footsteps. The patron came without heralds, as if secrecy might cover for appetite. A man whose robe had learned understatement and whose eyes had learned the habit of counting rooms. He bowed enough to keep the conversation alive. "I sponsor urgency," he said, and if vanity had been a color, it would have been faint on his mouth. "Your hinge work, triangles, bowls, delays the inevitable." He gestured to the river as if to prove that water always wins. "It does," the older man agreed, "which is why we work like bridges." He named the granaries that now breathed. The seals the guild had taught to blush when false. The breach the sail had learned to unlearn. The toll house that had stayed a bowl because a widow had chosen to be admired later rather than today. The patron offered a compliment that believed it was a verdict. "You make patience fashionable." "No," the boy said, polite to the rib. "We make it daily." The patron's gaze touched the practice pole and disliked its simplicity. "Do you think cloth and wind can hold back winter?" "They can teach it what door to use," the older man said, and let the answer rest where pride might pick it up when it had learned not to drop it. Something in the patron's face unknotted, irritation or interest hard to say. Perhaps both, as cousins often are. "Then let us wager a week," he said. "I send grain along the northern road if your ledgers prove that your jars have not lied. If they have, I claim the story." The woman with the staff did not wait for men to embroider fate. "Send the grain. We will keep the ledgers where roofs can read them." The reader with the bowl bowed to her, to the cracked bell, to the 2 cloths that had hired the wind wisely, and the patron, seeing himself outnumbered by a village that had decided to be adults, inclined a farewell that promised to return either with respect or with the old appetite that prefers applause to flour. Night took the square slowly, as if careful not to blur the chalk on the plank. They ate porridge that remembered a storm without trying to make a poem of it. He sat with the boy on the granary threshold, the smell of stored grain a warm, decent thing, and listened to roofs, remembering how to sound like roofs. "Is there an end to this?" the boy asked after a long, friendly quiet. "Or only a keeping?"
Keeping is the end, he said, and also the beginning. We sweep, we seal, we mend, we invite weather to be polite. Somewhere in the reeds, a bittern rehearsed its single true note. Somewhere upstream, the pavilion thought about whether to become useful. Somewhere far beyond these fields, banners turned in their sleep, surprised to find the night less interested in thunder than in cupboards that had decided, for one more week, to refuse being turned into theater. And on the road beyond the last house, where the darkness keeps its own ledgers, a courier's sandals began their counting, carrying a letter tied with a knot that respected rope, naming a place where patients, at dawn, would be asked to do something heavier than usual. Dawn waited at the edge of the fields, as if weighing whether to enter with ceremony or simply take off its shoes and come in softly. The letter had named a village, built where two valleys clasp like hands, where a river, troubled by boulders, forgets to be graceful and argues with itself. He and the boy arrived before the drums could decide their mood. Along the riverbank stood 2 rows of men in work coats turned inside out, sign of grievance in these parts, facing a file of soldiers whose armor looked newly confident, Polish still smelling of pride. Between them, a granary with its doors closed sat like an elder refusing to travel. The commander, young enough to dream of tidy paragraphs in chronicles, read from a writ that asked for provisional relief grain, and then for witness. The head woman, older than 2 droughts and not in a mood to flatter, lifted her palm and asked a question too simple for fiction. Who opens the door when winter is only a rumor? He leaned the practice pole against the granary wall. The cloths were quiet. The wind had not yet been hired. The boy stepped once into the space where the day would decide whether it would be busy or merely loud. "Let us begin at the floor," he said, "not with seals, with broom." It was foolish and somehow exactly right. They opened the granary, not to empty but to dust. Sweeping is the shape the body makes when it remembers humility. It gave both rows something to do that was not pretending to be thunder. As the small cloud of chaff rose, he asked the head woman to read aloud the village rule for lean months. 2 hands to seal, 2 roofs to count, monks to speak the word famine before any ladle is named generous. The commander listened with the caution of a man adjusting a helmet that had never yet met rain. "But the council's couriers are late," he said, "and bandits rehearse at our borders." He nodded, because truth enjoys being told even when it sides with impatience. "Then we will lend the village our triangles," he said, and named them. A monk to count breath, a scribe to count sacks, a captain to count knees that tremble and still stand. He did not speak of glory. He spoke of porch steps and roofs that forget their leaks when hands remember their work. By mid-morning, the first quarrel arrived wearing its ordinary coat, a rumor that soldiers would take samples to judge quality. He answered with bowls set on a long board under the open sky. 1 bowl for the infirm, 1 for widows, 1 for road workers whose rations had been diluted by the storm, each labeled in a hand even tired eyes could trust. "Let your samples be these," he told the commander. "Let your men carry them to the far edge of the valley, so the rumor must walk back through gratitude to find a second breath." The commander flushed in the difficult way honorable young do when given a better story than the one they had polished. He saluted without showing off and did as asked. The air shifted. The wind remembered a job it liked. Toward noon, trouble tried a new door. A rider came from the ridge with a banner stitched from 3 older banners, crestless and therefore greedy. He called himself custodian of roads and demanded toll for the privilege of fear. The boy looked at the horse before he looked at the man. The animal's ribs were honest, the man's were not. He stepped into the sunlight where everyone could see, held up the envoy's signet in one palm and the council edict in the other, and said what had been said 100 times by other mouths and would need to be said 100 more.
twin seals, read under sky. The rider did not laugh. He counted faces, found too few doors for noise to enter, and led his horse decide. The horse, hearing the river remember itself, chose water. The rider went with it, and returned soggier and briefly wiser. They worked until shadows remembered their trade. The granary ledger learned a rate of breathing it had forgotten. Gossips found themselves bored with honesty and went home to salt radishes. The commander offered rice to the headwoman and called it practice instead of magnanimity, which was exactly right. He and the boy sat on the threshold, backs to wood that smelled of 10 winters and 7 orderly springs. If patience were a blade, the boy asked, what would it cut? The knot that pride ties in hurry, he said, and the boy accepted the sentence as one accepts water after lifting beams, without debate. Evening arrived as it prefers to, making a small promise to every doorway. The square filled with bowls that had not raided their future to honor their present. Someone brought out the cracked bell that villages seem destined to hide and then remember. Someone else found a brush and wrote on a plank the names of those who would carry tomorrow's bowls, up canyon, past the last terrace where beans argue with wind. He felt the letters in his sleeve, the mother's harvest wish, the scholar's plea to cut rumor at the root, the Lord's confession of doubts, settle as if they had finally reached the rooms they were addressed to. The commander approached, helmet tucked under his arm as if newly aware it had been too proud for its own head. Your cloths, he said, nodding at the practice pole, make good weather. They only remind it, he answered. The rest is hands. Past midnight the river leveled its voice and the valley slept with one ear open, as valleys do when seasons are negotiating. He woke once to the sound of someone sweeping the granary floor for the pleasure of hearing order confess. It was the ambitious nephew from the mill town, traveling with a crew that now mended wheels for scorn instead of applause. He nodded across the threshold. The young man nodded back, less sharp now, as if edges had finally learned to carry weight without begging to be noticed. Before dawn, the monk from the Pepper Road set a ladle by the door and left without waking anyone. At the lip of the square he turned, bowed to the cracked bell, and kept walking. Acts like that never reach ledgers. They reach roofs. When morning took the valley's pulse and found it steadier than the day before, he and the boy lifted the practice pole and set it once more to their shoulders. The cloth stirred in that shy, satisfied way of work done sufficiently. They walked out along a path that had decided to be ordinary again, past a fox statue that had borrowed someone's scarf against the breeze, past soldiers who looked like men instead of plans, past jars that did not mistake being full for being selfish. On the ridge he turned to let the sky witness what the ground had promised to keep. Below, rice awaited modestly. Rivers negotiated like adults, and a bell with an unhandsome voice stood ready to tell the truth again. He thought of the pine where the first vow had listened. He thought of brush and stone, of bridges that took the weight nobody praised, of bowls that refused to humiliate the hand that offered them. He thought, tenderly, of the boy, whose shoulders now understood the grammar of bearing. Will the Banners ever learn to sleep through calm? The boy asked. Banners, he said, smiling toward a future that would test them both. Prefer stories with drums. We will keep giving them stories with doors. And now, friend who has walked with us through these lantern-lit miles, let me set this last bowl beside you. Thank you for keeping company with quiet victories and weather that chose to be polite, for listening when vows spoke softly, for lending your breath to bridges, ledgers, and the patience that remembers itself each dawn. The road will continue without us for a while. It always does. Close your eyes if you wish. Let the river keep counting. Let the pines keep their resinous counsel.
Somewhere a fox blinks, a roof exhale smiles, and two small cloths share the same wind. If dreams come, may they arrive like gates that know which way to open, and until morning finds its own footsteps, rest, held lightly by a world that, despite its banners, has learned a little more about how not to wound.